their fee.
We now move to the next item of business, which is a statement by Richard Lochhead on the annual EU fisheries negotiations. I note that Claire Baker and Jamie McGregor, the two major opposition party spokespeople, are not in the chamber. Notwithstanding, I now call Richard Lochhead. Mr Lochhead, you've got 13 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased to make this statement on fisheries as we approach the crucial end-of-year negotiations. As I speak, my officials are negotiating for Scotland at the EU-Norway talks in Bergen, which precede the December Fisheries Council that will determine Scotland's fishing opportunities for 2013. No one can deny that the Scottish fishing industry has been going through extremely challenging years, a period most recently blighted, of course, by the legal quagmire of the Cod Recovery Plan and, as always, overshadowed by the deeply flawed Common Fisheries Policy, a policy that we debated here back in June, and one which has failed fish stocks, our wider marine environment and, of course, our proud fishing communities. I want to change that, as I know many of my colleagues in this chamber do, because I and we passionately care about this industry, and it's certainly an industry I've worked alongside for many, many years. And when you look back, you can't fail to be impressed by the Scottish fishing industry's achievements in recent years. Between 2007 and 2011, our landing values have increased in real terms by nearly a fifth, culminating in 359,000 tonnes of seafood landed last year, valued at just over £500 million, the highest value in real terms this century. And all this, of course, delivered at a time of recession. So, Presiding Officer, or Deputy Presiding Officer, that's a big endorsement of the wonderful seafood our fishermen bring ashore and to which our leading onshore sector adds value. But, of course, we must never forget that in bringing seafood to our tables, many fishermen have made the ultimate sacrifice. However, as well as increasing value, there are many other positive trends in the sector. We've also seen increased quotas in recent years in a number of key stocks, including West Coast haddock, West Coast nephrops, North Sea haddock, North Sea whiting and North Sea herring. And the ICES advice for next year points to further increases across many of our most important stocks, up 15% for North Sea haddock, up 11% for North Sea whiting, 15% for North Sea saithe, 53% for North Sea megrim, 15% for North Sea herring and 18% for West of Scotland nephrops. But, of course, this happens every year. In our varied mixed fishery that we have in Scottish waters, the advice also points to reductions in a number of other important stocks as well, such as a 20% reduction, which is suggested for North Sea cod, a 48% reduction in West Coast haddock, a 20% reduction in Rockall cod, a 20% reduction in West of Scotland and North Sea monkfish, and a 21% reduction in North Sea nephrops, and a 40% reduction in West of Scotland megrim. So, as usual, it's fair to say we'll have our work cut out fighting to protect Scotland's position this December. We will be guided, however, as in previous years, by three cardinal principles. Firstly, our approach will be guided by science and stock sustainability. Secondly, we will be protecting the social economic well-being of our industry and, of course, the communities who depend upon it. And thirdly and finally, we will act in line with our commitment to achieve discard-free fisheries. And driving all these key principles is our conviction that conservation and stability of stocks will deliver long-term economic health for the industry. I'm sure most members of the Chamber share my view that it's absolutely immensely frustrating that the EU's deeply flawed fisheries regulations so often get in the way of many of those aims. If we take the Cod Recovery Plan as an example, this is a plan about cod, of course, but which greatly impacts on our ability to fish other stocks. And at last year's December Council, Parliament may recall, we came away from one of the toughest ever negotiations I've certainly experienced, with a victory over the Commission's lawyers in favour of conservation measures and Scotland's fleets. But despite everyone agreeing the Cod Recovery Plan is deeply flawed, including the scientists, our fishermen and even the Commission itself, the Commission still stubbornly insists on its rigid requirement to impose further automatic cuts in days at sea this year. Now, Commissioner Damanaki promised a review of the plan by spring this year to address Scotland's demands and those of other countries. But she didn't deliver any proposals until September, meaning that we could be well into next year before any freeze is approved by the European Parliament and the Council. But after all the waiting, we owe it to our fishermen to secure a freeze this December. Therefore, we are working tirelessly with the UK Government, other Member States and the European Presidency to achieve just that. However, we're now aware, of course, of a potential squabble between the European Parliament and the Council over who has the right to propose vital amendments and other technical conservation measures, and this could potentially delay the improvements we desperately require. And this is a very unfortunate example of legal navel-gazing by EU institutions we could do without, picking legal fights with each other while our fishers' livelihoods are endangered and our industry is placed at risk. Without these technical conservation measures, the EU will find itself unable to comply with its international obligations on fisheries conservation, and a number of stocks will be put at risk of serious damage. This internal dispute within Europe threatens to play havoc with our fisheries. So I am calling today, again, on all key players in the EU institutions to see sense and allow these technical conservation measures to remain in force for next year, and, of course, importantly, allow the changes we want to see to proceed at the same time. As if that weren't enough to be contending with, the rigid rules built into the cod recovery plan some years ago now require a 20% cut in the North Sea cod quota for 2013. Yet this is a stock which is steadily recovering, thanks to the huge efforts of Scotland's fishermen, and it's more than doubled over the past 6 years. A stock which our fishers are seeing in ever greater numbers, and that's indeed a finding backed by our scientists, and a stock where Scottish fishermen have delivered Europe's greatest reduction in cod discards, with rates plummeting from 43% in 2009 being discarded to around 25% in 2011. But imposing a 20% quota cut is simply a recipe for massive discards. Our fishers won't be able to avoid catching ever more plentiful cod, for which they have no quota, and will be forced, against their will, once again to dump dead fish back into the sea. Furthermore, our innovative discard-free catch quota scheme in Scotland will be placed on a knife edge, leaving 23 of our biggest whitefish vessels likely to be forced to start discarding cod again. The cod recovery plan is supposed to promote conservation, but actually threatens to leave long and winding trails of discarded fish across the North Sea and Europe's seas. But back in the real world, we've made the scientific case for maintaining the North Sea cod landings at this year's levels, avoiding an increase in discards and still achieving a healthy recovery of the stock by 2015. So a rollover of this year's quota will be another top priority at this month's negotiations. I'll be demanding a way out of the legal straitjacket which threatens to cause yet more obscene waste in our seas. And our fleet's cutting-edge cod conservation efforts should instead be rewarded and recognised. Scotland's innovative real-time closure programme leads the way in protecting abundances of cod and has been lauded by international scientists and others throughout Europe and beyond. And this year saw our North Sea prawn fleet adopt gears which ensured unwanted catches of fish are kept to an absolute minimum. So given these innovations, we now want to see fundamental changes to the cod plan, now, not later. So we're calling for more flexibility where there are progressive changes in fishing practices. For example, if fishermen use gears that reduce cod catches, wherever they are, Member States should be able to move allocations of fishing effort from one sea area to another to reflect changes in fish stock biology. The Chamber may be aware we saw the need for this flexibility this year when more plentiful prawns in the west led to greater fishing effort there, while much of the North Sea effort allocations actually remained unused. This has led to a shortage of effort in the west coast, to the point where we could actually run out of days at sea allocations there by January. I can, however, assure our West Coast prawn fishers that they will be provided with options to stay active through to the end of this effort year. We'll also be working in other ways to protect our West Coast fisheries in this month's negotiations. We'll want to maximise our valuable monkfish and megrim opportunities and safeguard the welcome recent expansion of the West Coast haddock fishery. So key priorities will be to increase monkfish flexibility in the west of Scotland and to mitigate the proposed megrim and haddock quota cuts in the west and in ways that still support long-term stability. Of course, we can expect these crucial decisions to be taken by bleary-eyed ministers at some ungodly hour in the early morning in Brussels, following hours of unseemingly horse trading. It's clear that that is not the way in which Europe should be doing its business and govern our fisheries. That's why we all believe that a radical overhaul of the common fisheries policy is absolutely vital. We have got to move away from Brussels-based micromanagement and bring decision-making closer to home, to those who know best how to govern and manage our rich and diverse waters. Scotland has been the first country out of the blocks promoting regionalisation of the flawed and broken CFP. We've been lauded for taking this initiative, and we continue to champion radical reform in the months ahead. It's now vital that the Council agreement reached in June on the CFP reform is not watered down by MEPs in the future. We have to seize this once-in-a-decade chance for the sake of our fishermen, fishing opportunities and the wider marine environment. But I can say to the Chamber, just as the CFP has failed Scotland, I'm afraid it's a similar story with the international mackerel negotiations, where we face the dispute with Iceland and Faroes, and where the same old stale talks grind on without moving forward an inch. It's clear the process is simply not working. For 5 years now, Iceland and Faroes have set their own arbitrary and irresponsible quotas. For 5 years, the same negotiators have failed to agree, while Iceland and Faroes massively overfish that stock. The EU and Norway have made offers to Iceland and Faroes far in excess of their previous shares, because we recognise recent changes in the distribution of the stock. But Iceland and Faroes have dug their heels in and refused to negotiate sensibly. But we will not be held to ransom, and I have made clear we will not resume talks until they come back to the table with realistic and concrete proposals in which we can have a sensible discussion. It is also vital the Commission make clear to us what trade sanctions they propose to impose on Iceland and the Faroes. We have now been waiting to see these sanctions for over 2 years while the same old logjam festers. And believe it or not, now the Commission's lawyers tell us we must give up an extra share of the mackerel quota allocated for 2013 over and above a sizeable reduction in quota already advised by the scientists. Well, I think our message to them is very, very clear. We cannot and we will not accept such an absurd situation where responsible fishermen are hit with a double whammy to benefit irresponsible fishermen. We have to be guided throughout these negotiations by natural justice, fairness and common sense, rather than the arcane reasoning of Brussels lawyers. We simply cannot reward bad behaviour by giving up that extra share. We must also challenge ourselves to think more radically about how we can change the game to find a breakthrough. And certainly that's the message I'll be sending to the UK Government and to the Commission over the coming weeks and months. So, Deputy Presiding Officer, we have some stiff challenges ahead as we prepare ourselves for this month's end-of-year negotiations. Our sights are set firmly on achieving a freeze in the cod plan's annual effort cuts and a rollover in the North Sea cod quota. But we will not lose sight of the other important objectives, mainly on the West Coast, where we will work very, very hard to mitigate potential cuts to quotas where we feel they are not justified. We will ensure Scotland's priorities are uppermost in the minds of UK ministers, and will do our utmost to fight for Scotland's interests across the board. Our aim throughout will be to maximise the opportunities for fishers and thereby create the platform for Scottish fisheries and the stocks they rely on to thrive and survive in 2013 and beyond.
Many thanks. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in his statement. It would be helpful if members who wish to speak and who wish to ask questions press the request to speak buttons now. First question to Claire Baker, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for the advance copy of his statement. I know there is disappointment that we have moved away from having a debate this week, and these negotiations will impact on the livelihood of so many families and fishing communities who bring so much economic and social value to Scotland. These heated and chaotic negotiations are well documented, and they are as annual as Christmas, with probably as much confusion but perhaps not so happy an outcome. We urgently need reform of the Common Fisheries Policy to bring an end to this yearly wrangle. I understand the frustrations over the cod recovery plan. The Scottish fishing sector have made significant investment and can demonstrate return in stocks for this effort, and yet there is a lack of reward from what is an inflexible and unresponsive plan. And time is running out, and the Cabinet Secretary does say that he is calling on all key players in the EU institutions to see sense. What response is he getting to these concerns so far? And also, the Cabinet Secretary rightly emphasises the importance of mackerel. It is unfair that Scottish mackerel has had its MSC certificate withdrawn because of the unacceptable behaviour of Iceland and the Faroes. How will the Cabinet Secretary balance Scotland's clear commitment to sustainable fishing with the demand of fairness for this important sector? And does he believe sanctions are the only answer? How will they be introduced? And what is the timescale for them having any impact? And finally, does he anticipate that a quota cut might be a condition of these sanctions?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Claire Baker for her comments. I certainly agree with her sentiments that it's now time for our fishermen to be given more reward, given the conservation measures, the trailblazing conservation measures they've adopted in Scotland's seas, which has seen many stocks now being fished at maximum sustainable yield, which effectively means they're sustainable, and that's a huge step forward, and the Commission would be wise to take that on board at this year's negotiations. In terms of the potential delay in getting some of the changes we desperately need over the next few weeks, that may arise from the internal wrangling between the European Parliament and the European Council. It's certainly my view, and that of many other member states I've been speaking to, that we need the European Presidency, the relevant MEPs on the various committees within the European Parliament and the Commission to get in the same room and hammer this out prior to the December negotiations or soon thereafter, so we don't have these unnecessary delays which are down to competition for who has the right to propose the amendments, and everyone should be putting the interests of our fish stocks and fishing industries first at this crucial stage. And in terms of the mackerel dispute, Claire Baker's quite right. We have to balance the need of sustainability with getting fairness for the Scottish sector. And the best way forward, of course, is not sanctions, but they are necessary. But the best way forward is for the parties to come back to the negotiating table and be sensible. We can't have a situation just now where one side of the table is making all the offers and the other side of the table is making no offers. That is not acceptable, it's not fair, and of course, as I said in my opening remarks, we have to have natural justice. So I, in that negotiation, will not allow the Commission to ask Scotland to deliver a double cut as a condition of imposing sanctions, but I will continue to urge all the parties to come round to the negotiating table.
Many thanks. Jamie McGregor.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for sharing the statement. I'm glad he will argue for a rollover of this year's 2AC figure and also will push for a freeze on the annual reduction in days at sea. Turning to the West Coast, the Cabinet Secretary says the West Coast prawn fishers will be provided with options to stay active through to the end of this effort year. Bearing in mind the Scottish Government has known about this problem since May, can he give some specific details of these options, and does he recognise that Marine Scotland's suggestion of them using flexible grid fitted to each net are not acceptable on safety grounds and because of the unsuitability of such grid in the West Coast sea areas? And also, is the Cabinet Secretary concerned that the where possible proviso for maximal sustainable yield element of the reformed CFP has been dropped? Does he agree with the fishing industry reps that an MSY for all stocks at the same time is simply unachievable, and how will he ensure that we get practical legislation in that area?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. Jamie McGregor highlights what is an important issue in the West Coast of Scotland, and whilst I can be accused of many things, I was unable to predict the lack of prawns appearing in the North Sea a few months ago, which of course led to the unprecedented amount of fishing effort transferring from the east to the West Coast, which of course gave us all a big challenge in how to manage the days at sea that was available for the West Coast, because the European Commission do not allow us to transfer days at sea from the East Coast to the West Coast. We are asking for that flexibility to avoid that problem happening again. But can I assure Jamie McGregor in the Chamber, we've worked very closely with the West Coast fisheries interests, and of course the compromise we arrived at allowed fishing to continue. And as far as January is concerned, we're working very closely with the West Coast sectors to make sure there's economic activity for the fleet in the West Coast and they don't have to tie up much more than what they would normally have to do at that time of year. So we are paying close attention to that, and we'll do what's best for the fishing communities on the West Coast and keep the members across all parties informed of how we take that forward. In terms of the Common Fisheries Policy negotiations, the maximum sustainable yield, which Jamie McGregor says is quite rightly very difficult to achieve for all stocks at the same time in a mixed fishery, that's why we are looking for the appropriate flexibility within the Common Fisheries Policy negotiations. We're trying to persuade other Member States and Europe that because we have this mixed fishery in Scottish waters, we cannot simply command biology. We have to have flexibility because not all stocks will be at the same level at the same time where it's a mixed fishery. So it's a very important point the member raises.
Thank you. Angus MacDonald to be followed by David Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware of Ulrika Rodus Amendment 15, which would require Member States to close 10 to 20% of their territorial waters to all fishing activities for at least 5 years. If this proposal were to go ahead, it clearly goes against the decentralisation agenda, would have a devastating effect on Scottish coastal communities and in particular on small-scale boats, and harbours within those areas would effectively cease to function. What can the Cabinet Secretary do to impress upon all MEPs the imperative to reject this proposal, particularly when the Lib Dem's sole MEP on the Fisheries Committee, Chris Davis, has in the past advocated closing down the industry completely for 2 years?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks. The member refers to the co-decision process that now takes place between the European Parliament and the European Council over the Common Fisheries Policy, which means, of course, that MEPs now have a crucial role in shaping the future European fisheries policy. It's really important that we have sensible amendments brought forward by the MEPs. It is indeed the case. There is one amendment on the table just now which would effectively close down Scottish waters of an arbitrary figure of 10 to 20% for a number of years. That's a ludicrous proposal. I expect many Member States will be opposing that, and I hope that all MEPs will seriously oppose that amendment as well, given the damage it would inflict on Scotland's fishing communities. And I can assure Angus MacDonald that we are putting a great amount of effort into putting Scotland's case across to all MEPs who have a role in these negotiations. I've met many personally myself in recent weeks and months. I spoke to Pat the Cope Gallagher only yesterday, the renowned Irish MEP, on the telephone about some of these issues as well.
Thank you. David Stewart, to be followed by Rob Gibson.
Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary will be well aware that the scientific advice from ICIS is for an increase in total allowable catch for the West of Scotland net crops. That, of course, is to be welcomed, but the Maldigan North West Fishermen's Association tell me that this may be subject to a 6 weeks closure from the 21st of December, which they claim lies at the door of Marine Scotland, not their fleet. Can the Cabinet Secretary investigate this claim and hopefully resolve it before the deadline is reached?
Cabinet Secretary.
I have worked closely with North West fishermen and Maldic fishermen over recent months on this issue. As I said in my answer to Jamie McGregor, this was an unprecedented situation where fishing effort transferred from the North Sea to the West Coast because for the first time in many years the prawn stocks did not appear in the usual numbers there. So some of the bigger vessels went to fish on the West Coast. Because the European Commission only gives us one pot of days for the West Coast, and we don't have flexibility between East Coast and West Coast, it of course gave the industry and the Scottish Government a very challenging management situation. This highlights why we need to get radical reform, and not only of the Common Fisheries Policy per se, but the Cod Recovery Plan, which is the root of all this problem. But I have worked very closely with the industry. That's why we reached an agreement with them that took into account their fishing patterns between now and the end of January, and they've been able to fish each week since that issue arose. And as I said to Jamie McGregor, we're continuing to work on how we can ensure there's economic activity for the West Coast Fleet in January.
Thank you. Rob Gibson, to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These annual talks are set against the need for a radical overhaul of the Common Fisheries Policy. What position does the Cabinet Secretary think that the UK Government and the Council Ministers as a whole is likely to take on the threat of tradable fishing concessions, and what implications would there be for fishermen in Scotland in the coming years?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. This highlights one of the big concerns we've had throughout the CFP negotiations, which was the original proposal by the Commission to introduce individual transferable concessions, which in my book is individual transferable quotas, which is also the privatisation of historic fishing rights in Scottish waters. And I opposed that, as did the Scottish industry and most Scottish fishing communities. Thankfully, that now seems to be off the table, and that threat has been removed, and Scotland was in the vanguard of highlighting the threat that posed to the future of our fishing communities. Of course, there are some MEPs who are tabling amendments wishing for that to be reintroduced and to be part of the new Common Fisheries Policy. And someone mentioned Chris Davies, the Lib Dem fisheries spokesperson in the European Parliament, who is a leading advocate of this as a measure to reduce fishing fleets. Well, Scotland's fishing fleet has paid its fair share in recent years, and it should not be cut any further, and we don't want to see the privatisation of Scotland's fishing rights.
Thank you very much. Tavish Scott, to be followed by Graham Day.
Presiding Officer, my apologies for not being present at the opening words of Mr Lockhead's statement, and I am grateful to him for an advance copy of that. On the Cod Recovery Plan, based on his statement to Parliament this afternoon, is it the case that the Euro lunatics have absolutely taken over the European asylum? Is he actually arguing that their proposal is that our fishermen do need more days to catch their quota, but instead a new internal European row could achieve exactly the opposite, a cut in days and indeed a further cuts in quota? Would the Cabinet Secretary also accept that the Shetland whitefish boat, the Achuras, caught 360 boxes of marketable fish just the other day with a Marine Scotland scientist on board, only one of which was of an unmarketable size, therefore proving conservation mechanisms are working? And would he therefore accept that when he comes back from Brussels, what we absolutely need for our industry is both a rise in quotas that matter financially and also indeed a rise in days at sea as well?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I totally agree with Tavish Scott's sentiment on the danger of the lunatics taking over the asylum in Brussels. Should we have a situation where internal legal wrangling between the European Parliament and the European Council prevents what's doing right for Europe's cod stocks and Scottish fishermen. That's why it's really important that we bang heads together and that the various key players in this dispute get in a room and sort this out before the December negotiations. Otherwise, there will be a very painful price to pay, potentially, by Scotland's fishing communities due to factors out with their control. In terms of Shetland's contribution to fisheries conservation, I wish to put on record that the Shetland fishermen have made a huge contribution to cod conservation and conservation of other important stocks, and that does show that Scotland is indeed leading the way and that our fishermen should be rewarded, not punished, by these negotiations.
Thank you. Graham Day to be followed by Margaret McDougall.
Thank you. Scots MEPs Ian Hodgson and Stuart Stevenson, in evidence to the Rural Affairs Committee on November 21st, were agreed on the need for the adoption of sensible rules and achievable targets for elimination of discards. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise us of any progress being made towards achieving that goal?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, thankfully, Scotland has negotiated some flexibility in recent years that have enabled us to cut discards in Scottish waters, and that's why the Scottish fleet should be commended for cutting discards more than any other country has achieved in their own waters. That's a huge feather in the cap for Scotland's fishing industry and our conservation credentials. And indeed, of course, as I said in the opening remarks, in the pivotal cod stock, the cod biomass is now double what it was in 2006. That's a huge step forward, and hopefully will be fished at sustainable levels by 2015, which will be a massive breakthrough. Again, we have to now guard against ill-informed measures being adopted at the fisheries negotiations this month, which would lead to an increase in discards, not a further reduction.
Thank you. Margaret McDougall to be followed by Dave Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I apologise for my lateness into the Chamber when I missed the opening statement. Can the Cabinet Secretary elaborate on how receptive his talks have been with other Member States around flexibility of the code quota rather than 20%, as this will seriously affect the livelihood of our fishermen and undoubtedly increase discards, despite our discard-free quota scheme?
Cabinet Secretary.
It's a good point, and where I can hopefully offer comfort to the Chamber is that many other Member States do share Scotland's concerns over some of the proposals on the table. Because of the clear recognition that a cut in cod quota when the cod stock's actually recovering means it's more difficult to avoid by the fleet, and therefore discards will actually increase, not decrease, and it will not give any benefit whatsoever to cod mortality. Other Member States who fish the same cod stocks as we do recognise that as well. Hopefully that will be an effective alliance to help the Commission see sense.
Thank you. Dave Thompson to be followed by Alex Ferguson.
I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's comments on the obscenity of discards, but I'm worried about his other comments on advice for the West Coast, because an increase in the prawn quota, coupled with a decrease in the haddock, monkfish and megrim quota, will almost certainly, if that goes ahead, mean more discards. So can the Cabinet Secretary tell us what he plans to do to prevent this danger of more discards on the West Coast, whilst at the same time protecting the very valuable and sustainable West Coast prawn fishery?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I say I recognise, of course, the importance of the prawn fishery to the West Coast fishing communities, and we have worked closely with the West Coast, and I want to commend their fishermen on adopting a number of new selective gear measures in recent months and years in the West Coast, which will help cut down discards of other stocks they don't have quota for. That's a big step forward, which should help us strike the balance that Dave Thompson refers to. I should point out, yes, there are some quota increases happening on the West Coast, which are good news, but even when we look at the West of Scotland haddock reduction, we have to remember that's a stock that went up by 200% last year. So still a substantial increase compared to 2 years ago of the West of Scotland haddock stock, which we should bear in mind.
Thank you very much. Alex Ferguson to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary rightly mentioned the fact that a 20% quota cut for cod would greatly endanger the catch quota trials, which the UK and Denmark have been running together and which have been so successful in reducing discards. So can I ask what representations the Cabinet Secretary has made, both within the UK and within the EU, to promote an extension of the catch quota trials, and how likely he perceives any such extension to be?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, and I thank Alex Ferguson for highlighting the success that has been the catch quota trials, which have been very innovative and arose through a joint initiative between the Scottish Government and the industry in Scottish waters, which prevents any discards, but of course requires cod quota for the boats that are participating. This has featured very heavily in the EU-Norway negotiations in recent years. It's been very frustrating and disappointing. We've not been able to expand that scheme. It seems to me very cruelly ironic that a scheme which stops discards and promotes fisheries conservation at the same time is not supported by all the negotiating partners due to other negotiating issues at stake. That's very unfortunate. So we're putting conservation first and what's best for the cod stocks first as well. That remains on the table. We want to expand that scheme. Unfortunately, at the moment, the threat of a 20% cut in cod quota actually threatens the scheme, doesn't support it.
Thank you. Stuart Stevenson, to be followed by Elaine Murray.
Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm what role the Scottish Government has had in seeking to resolve the mackerel dispute with the Faroe Islands and Iceland?
Cabinet Secretary.
This is a huge issue for thousands of families in Scotland whose livelihoods depend on what is Scotland's most valuable fish stock, mackerel. Therefore, it is again very frustrating that the international negotiating framework has virtually broken down. That meant that the previous 10-year agreement has now not been replaced, but instead we're seeing unilateral quotas being fished by Iceland and the Faroe Isles. I continue to urge these countries to come back to the table so we can have a sensible negotiation. If we have to go down the road of sanctions, clearly we want these in place as soon as possible to show these countries we do mean business. But it's in no one's interest, not in the interest of the fishing communities in those countries or our countries, if this stock is fished out and all our respective countries and industries lose thousands of livelihoods. That is in no one's interest. So it's really important we all get back around the table as soon as possible. And as I said previously, and I can say to Stuart Stevenson, because I know this is a very important issue in his own constituency, that we are now trying to think out the box of new ways that could lead to a breakthrough in these international negotiations.
Many thanks. Dr. Elaine Murray, to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary made reference in his speech to the crazy process of annual negotiation and the logjam of amendments to the European legislation which would introduce a reformed policy. Does he share concerns that delaying the second reading of the legislation beyond the end of next year would compromise the very introduction of the new CFP and condemn our fishermen to further years of the current failed policy?
Secretary.
Thank you. It's quite right to highlight the dangers of delaying the technical regulations. If they are not renewed because they're held up because of the dispute between the European Parliament and the European Council, then some existing closed areas would no longer be closed, which would not be good for fisheries conservation. Other technical measures that are supposed to be in place to promote conservation would also not be in place because the regulation would not be renewed for 2013. So this would lead to damaging of very important fish stocks across Europe, but most importantly in our waters as well. And of course, some of the changes we need to see to improve the current regulations through these amendments, they would also be delayed. So again, I can only repeat my call. I hope all parties will support this, that we need all the key players in Europe to bang their heads together, get in a room and sort this out so we can do what's right for the fishing communities and for the fish stocks.
Thank you very much. Mark MacDonald, to be followed by Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I saw in a debate in Westminster the other week the UK Minister saying that Scotland gets a good deal because we are on occasion allowed into the room during negotiations. Does the Cabinet Secretary share my belief that given that these talks are to be led by Cyprus, population 1.1 million, that it's not just time Scotland was in the room negotiating, but also had its opportunity to take its turn at leading negotiations in future?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the member will be surprised to learn that I certainly agree with his comments. There will be no country that will make our fishing industry more of a priority than Scotland, and that's why we should be in the lead for all these negotiations and at the top table in our own right. And I do note with interest how Europe is given some comfort by the fact that the Irish are about to take over the presidency in a few weeks of Europe for both the common fisheries policy negotiations, the crucial stage of those, and also for the crucial stage of the common agricultural policy. And the word round the Council of Ministers and throughout Europe is, isn't it good that a small country that knows what it's doing and has a key interest in some of these issues and makes them a priority is going to be in the driving seat for these negotiations? I think that shows the power of small nations in Europe.
Thank you very much. Alison Johnson, to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My apologies for not being present for the opening of the Cabinet Secretary's statement, and thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. If there is a rollover of this year's quota, what additional measures will the Government take to ensure that fishing mortality in cod continues to decrease? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, we are pushing for a rollover of the cod quota because a cut in the cod quota will not conserve any extra cod. It will only increase discards. The fact of the matter, as I know the member will welcome, is that the cod stock in the North Sea has doubled since 2006. It is very much going in the right direction. It's very much recovering, thanks to the magnificent efforts of the Scottish fleet. However, of course, we continue to work with all our fleets on more technical measures, selective gear. As I said before, just in the last 12 months, we've seen new gears adopted by many of our fleets in Scottish waters, and that has to be welcomed, and that will contribute even more to the recovery of the cod stock.
Liam MacArthur.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In the statement, the Cabinet Secretary set out the potential threat of a 20% cut in the North Sea monkfish quota. As you'll be well aware, this is a critical stock for the whitefish fleet, not least those in my own constituency in Orkney. In the past, there's been a lack of scientific evidence underpinning the Commission's proposals to cut this stock. Can you advise what scientific evidence he'll be able to bring to these negotiations, how confident he is of being able to resist what would be a devastating cut to large parts of the Scottish whitefish fleet?
Cabinet Secretary.
Liam MacArthur quite rightly raises some of the more high-value stocks, particularly to the industries in Orkney and indeed Shetland, and how important it is we take these into account during the negotiations. We are not happy with the current proposals for the cut in the Megram stock. We are having a proposal at the moment for a decrease in the West Coast and a substantial increase in the North Sea. And of course, there's an arbitrary line in our waters, and we think we should have a much more sensible split of those stocks, and we're putting together a scientific case just now to make that argument, because we recognise the west of Scotland, fishermen in particular, would suffer if there was too drastic a cut in the west of Scotland Megram and monkfish stocks. But in terms of monkfish, you'll also know there's a long-standing issue over flexibility between the North Sea and the West Coast, and the more flexibility we have, and as long as that continues, that will greatly help the fishermen with their day-to-day activities.
Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on the Leveson-Report. Point of order, Mr McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. How will we explain to Scottish fishermen that we have abandoned the most important annual debate on fisheries in order to debate regulations on what fish suppers are wrapped in?
That wasn't a point of order, and the Parliamentary Bureau did have such a discussion today. I suggest that you have a word with your business manager. I now invite members who wish to debate to press the request to speak button now. I note that Ruth Davidson is not in the chamber. I now call on Alex Salmond to open the debate. First Minister, you've got 14 minutes.
Presiding Officer, for the seventh time in as many decades, a report has been published which deals with concerns about the press. On the previous 6 occasions, which were between 1949 and 1993, there was no Scottish Parliament to debate the implementation of those reports. Lord Justice Leveson, therefore, has set this Parliament a challenge, and it's one that I think we should meet in a manner which is considered, constructive and consensual. This afternoon I want to demonstrate, first of all, why Lord Justice Leveson's report requires a specific response from Scotland. Secondly, I want to discuss the Scottish Government's initial view of the report's chief recommendation. In doing that, I want to set out clearly the difference, as I see it, between a statutory regulation of the press, a state regulation of the press, which I oppose, and voluntary self-regulation recognised under Scots law, which I believe has merit. And thirdly, I want to underline the importance of adopting, if at all possible, a cross-party approach to press regulation in Scotland. Now, Presiding Officer, in the very first paragraph of the very first page of his report, Lord Justice Leveson says, quote, "My report may be less than helpful to those with decision-making responsibilities in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, but I have sought to set out my analysis and conclusions in a sufficiently explicit and reasoned way to enable the experts within the devolved jurisdictions to see how they could be made to fit." That's the words of Leveson himself. Now, it's worth making clear that elements of criminality and wider media malpractice that sparked the Leveson report are not, in general, associated with the Scottish press as a whole. For example, the Information Commissioner's December 2006 report, What Price Privacy Now?, which was cited by Leveson, listed all transactions with private investigators that he had investigated. Only 7 of all of these transactions, that's 0.19% of the total, were by a Scottish publication. Therefore, I find it difficult to understand some suggestions I've seen, well, heard on the radio, for example, the other day, that somehow this Parliament should have acted in 2006. There were 2 major problems with acting in 2006. One is that data protection is one of the areas which is reserved to Westminster, but secondly, there was no evidence on what was published that there was a widespread issue in Scotland to be met. But however, we now know absolutely that there are certainly victims in Scotland to whom this Parliament owes an appropriate response. Strathclyde Police have now been given the details of 26 potential victims of phone hacking or press intrusion arising from consideration of the records of Glen Mulcair. They have also details of a further 180 instances of potential criminality concerning victims of illegal data access. Now, I want to stress to this Parliament that that information was only obtained by Strathclyde Police on their request in July of last year, despite the fact that these records have been held for some years by the Metropolitan Police. But as soon as Strathclyde Police obtained that information on their request, they set up Operation Rubicon. As many as possible of these potential victims were contacted by Strathclyde Police to put them in that position of knowing what may have been done to them in terms of privacy. We should also look at some of the wider aspects of what Lord Justice Leveson was saying. There is no doubt that he was extremely moved by instances of ordinary people coming before his inquiry, some of them from Scotland, who made explicit the damage that had been done to their lives, not necessarily by phone hacking or blagging or whatever, but by the activities of the press in general, and that was a deeply moving experience for Lord Leveson and should be a significant factor in this Parliament's consideration. Inaction would have consequences for past and potential victims of press intrusion and also for public confidence in the press. Furthermore, as Lord Justice Leveson acknowledged, any action to implement his report requires to take account of Scots law. There's a number of really important reasons for that. Firstly, it's been said in a number of quarters that any such action would require to be accompanied by a firm statement of press freedom. We have enshrined in this Parliament's founding statute the European Convention of Human Rights, which has exactly such a statement in Article 10, which enshrines the freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority. That provides a very strong statutory guarantee, an even stronger guarantee in Scotland because of the position of the European Convention in this Parliament than pertains in England. There are other differences. Leveson makes some suggestions with regard to punitive or exemplary damages. We haven't had exemplary damages in Scotland since 1908, and yet they were fundamental to one of the key incentives that Leveson suggests for the press abiding by his recommendation. And finally and fundamentally, our law of defamation differs significantly from the English law of libel. So given that press regulation is the responsibility of this Parliament, that there have been victims of press malpractice in Scotland, and that there is a separate legal framework which operates in Scotland, then Lord Justice Leveson's view set out in the first paragraph of his report is surely unarguable, that we require to make in Scotland, using the expertise that we have in terms of Scots law, a significant response to his report and recommendations. The recommendations require serious, expert, distinctive consideration within Scotland. They cannot just be left to Westminster. I give way to Mr. Rennie.
I agree with the First Minister that this Parliament needs to consider this matter carefully. But is he ruling out a UK independent watchdog, or is that something that he's prepared to consider?
First Minister.
Well, can I come on to that in a few seconds explicitly? But the point I'm making, the case I've made over the last few days, is that the Scottish solution lies in our legislative responsibilities. By definition, in a self-regulatory system, it isn't for the politicians to define what comes forward from the industry. That's from the industry to determine. What's for us to determine is the statutory underpinning, if any, this Parliament wishes to implement in that system according to Leveson's recommendations. So in beginning a process of consideration, I don't want to see us repeat the mistakes perhaps made by Westminster. As Willie Rennie knows, I was somewhat miffed that we weren't given access to the report in the same timescale as Westminster last week, but perhaps that's to our advantage. Perhaps that's to our advantage if we could use that timescale not to get ourselves into fixed positions at this stage. However, I do want to see and put out and want to set out to this Parliament that this Government's initial assessment of the key recommendation that Lord Leveson made. Leveson envisaged a press regulator that's developed by the industry itself, but then receives some recognition through a statutory mechanism. No one would be obliged to join that new body. To provide an incentive to do so, however, those who joined would be given some limited legal privileges. Leveson sets out clearly there is a difference between statutory regulation and the statutory underpinning of self-regulation. And that principle, in my estimation, which provides the essence of the report, seems to me logically sound. It also appears to have very substantial public support. And it's a principle that's already been recognised elsewhere in these islands over the last few years, since Ireland passed its Defamation Act in 2009, which gave a statutory basis to its own Press Council and Ombudsman. Now, significantly, and it's a very, very important point, that 7 UK titles have signed up to the Irish system, including one, the Daily Star, which is not a member of the Press Complaints Commission at the present moment. Now, the Daily Star provided no evidence to Leveson that its investigative journalism is withering in Ireland while it's blossoming in London. And similarly, the Sunday Times has never argued that its UK edition flourishes in a free press, while its Irish edition is somehow constrained by fear. Instead, as Leveson noted, these papers do not appear to allow any principled objections to statutory underpinning of press self-regulation to get into the way of constructive and willing participation in the system. As I've said over the last few days, there's a number of features in the Irish system which look to me very, very attractive. But does that mean that we in Scotland should follow the Irish model exactly? No, it doesn't. It just means that we should look seriously at whether it can be adapted sensibly in a Scottish context. Now, no one, and certainly not us, can stop newspapers or journalists from being careless, inaccurate or excessively intrusive. But the Irish example suggests we might be able to establish a framework for the underpinning in Scots law of self-regulation to the press. Now, can I just come to Mr Rennie's point in particular? It is up to the press, not the government, to establish its own regulatory structure. Depending on what the press decides, that structure could apply to other parts of these islands of the United Kingdom. Now, I think Mr Rennie's had his shot, and I think I've been generous in answering his point. However, the statutory underpinning cannot simply be UK-wide, as perhaps has been suggested elsewhere. That underpinning must adhere to Scots law. A Scottish solution is required for the underpinning, not necessarily for the organisation, but for the underpinning of the self-regulatory body. Now, that body would need to meet certain criteria set in Scotland for statutory recognition. For example, it might need to provide a very clear complaints procedure, a potential source of redress for people who felt they'd been wronged, a viable, low-cost alternative to the courts. Membership of the body would be voluntary. Individual newspapers would need to consider the advantages and disadvantages of membership, for example, in relation to potential costs in defamation action. Now, it's sometimes been presented that the press are united against such a move. I don't think that's the case. And I looked with great interest in the editorial on St Andrew's Day in the Courier newspaper, which says that, it says I was right to set up a cross-party group to scrutinise the legislation in a Scottish context. But here's the important point. There is no need to fear having two regulatory systems for the press in the UK. After all, newspapers act under two defamation and contempt of court regimes at the moment. I think there may well be more flexibility in the part of the press than sometimes is being presented at the present moment. I give way to Mr Scott.
Terry Scott.
First Minister giving way. If his principle is that we could end up with two separate systems, and I'm sure he does it across the UK, and he does accept that newspapers, of course, cover both boundaries, or cross all boundaries, who would pay for that separate system in Scotland? Surely not victims and taxpayers?
No, the self-regulated system, in the essence, as is clear from the report, which I'm absolutely sure that a distinguished advocate such as Tavish Scott has read, is a self-regulated system must, by definition, be paid for by the industry itself, whatever it may be. There may be ways, incidentally, to ensure that these costs are not as onerous as some other people have suggested, but nonetheless, the industry pays for a self-regulated system. Now, as the Chamber knows, I've written to my counterparts in this Chamber to invite them to talks on Thursday. I welcome their indication that they will accept that invitation. I am proposing the establishment of an independent implementation group chaired by a recent a Court of Session judge. I can confirm that all parties here at Holyrood are welcome to suggest non-practising political representatives as potential members of that implementation group. The purpose of the group is to meet the challenge set to us by Leveson of how to adapt a proposal which was inevitably very much attached to the English legal system into a Scottish legal context. Please.
Ms Lamont.
The implementation group consider the possibility of, through the legislative consent motion, working with the UK Government to have a regulator that meets the demands of Scots law but provides for one regulator across the United Kingdom. Will we be allowed to look at that?
First Minister.
If Labour wants to propose that as a party, then obviously there's a range of options available. But I have to say that one of the things that this Parliament, surely there should be no argument about this Parliament responding to, is our responsibility for Scots law and our responsibility for the people of Scotland. And although there are many occasions in which legislative consent motions can make sense, I would have thought in terms of Scots law, this is something which we should accept our responsibility for. But of course, the group can look at how to adapt the Leveson recommendations to Scottish circumstances. That is one issue we need to consider. I'm not, for example, absolutely convinced that Ofcom is the appropriate organisation to determine whether a self-regulated body is meeting statutory criteria, nor do I think a politician should do it. I think there are other ways to do that. An implementation group would look, very importantly, how we can ensure that response to Leveson takes account of any emerging solutions being developed at Westminster, whatever timescale the various parties at Westminster say that things have to be done. It is open, as Joanne Lamont says, for the implementation group to propose to work alongside Westminster. But of course, we have to abide by our central responsibility, because if we don't, what are we going to say to the victims of phone hacking, of invasions of privacy within Scotland? We want to explain that without a lead happening at Westminster, we don't have the ingenuity, the ambition or the will to meet the public's desire for change. Presiding Officer, I am sufficiently ambitious for this Parliament to think we can do better than that. I am sufficiently optimistic to believe we can seize an opportunity to take a serious, consensual, cross-party approach here at Holyrood to rise to the challenge laid down by Leveson. If we do that, we will do our duty to those who have suffered from unacceptable practices of some media organisation. We will fit that balance between the expectations of the public and the essential freedom of the press, and we can ensure that in Scotland, this seventh inquiry into press regulation secures more enduring results than any of its 6 predecessors.
I now call on Joanne Lamont. Ms Lamont, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And in opening, can I confirm that I am willing to work across party on a consensus basis to try and take this debate forward. And I do hope that the First Minister is not prejudging what he believes the outcome to be in his view. It does rather feel that on Thursday of last week he had set a course which was not to be moved on, and I certainly think the building consensus is not simply about getting other parties to agree with his view of how we stand up for the people of Scotland in this issue, but that we work together in that regard. Now, the debate today is entitled The Way Forward, but before we can be clear on that, I believe we must also remember how we got here. We do not have to look far for examples of how important a free press is to the democracy we enjoy. Watergate, the expenses scandal, the thalidomide victims, just 3 examples of journalism which would not have been possible without a free press. And as an opposition leader, I am all too aware of the need for the press to hold the government to account. Indeed, even in the last few days, we have seen media pressure force multinational companies to review their tax arrangements. The press is an essential pillar in our society, and it's something that has also shaped the way we do politics in this country. It is the prism which informs people's views, opinions and politics. Now, we all agree that we need a free press, but we must also recognise the impact that comes with that power, particularly when media ownership is overly concentrated. The result of this has been relationships between the media and politicians which have gone beyond what is appropriate. It has meant common interests be pursued before what is best for the people of this country. We now have an opportunity to change that and to make our politics better. I was a Labour activist in the 1992 general election, I know it's hard to believe, when we failed to overturn John Major's government. And I watched with great frustration at that time as the right-wing press turned on and produced Neil Kinnock. And I can understand why some people in my party decided they would do their best not to let that happen again. So I can understand why Tony Blair hired Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson. I can understand why he flew to Australia to meet with Murdoch. And I can understand why Gordon Brown tried in vain to maintain those relationships with the press barons. And I can also understand why a nationalist party, keen first to convince the public that they were worth taking a chance on as a Scottish government, and later that independence offered a better way for the people of Scotland, would also try to build these relations with the media and make these compromises. Politicians are in the business of ideas, and if you are to communicate these ideas to the public, it will largely be done through the prism of the media, no matter how ferocious or friendly it may seem. And this is difficult territory in where we now find ourselves. And where people stand should not be about black and white, for or against state intervention, a kind of cartoon debate of the politics here, but wrestling with some very difficult issues. And it is important, I think, we inform our thinking by the debate that's going on across the country. Fascinating views from all sides within the press industry and beyond, wrestling with these difficult issues. And I hope going forward we recognise that we are taking steps forward together in an area that is difficult. For, of course, the world changed in July 2011. While it was clearly wrong, many of us couldn't get angry about celebrities complaining about their phones being hacked. Maybe we should have. But when we heard the allegation that the voicemails of Millie Dowler had been accessed, we knew this couldn't go on. Millie was just 13 when she was abducted on her way home from school near her home in Surrey. Her body was found in woods nearly 6 months later. The horror that the Dowler family went through every day during that period and every day since is beyond anything we can comprehend. But the idea that a mother and father, facing up to every parent's worst nightmare, were given false hope because a reporter hacked into and deleted her messages, knowing that she was probably dead, made all of us, I believe, sick to our stomachs. I'm sure that feeling was shared by every parent, every family, every decent-minded person. And it was at this point that the dam broke and the public were given an insight into some of the practices used in some aspects of the media and were rightly sickened. At that point, it became obvious that change was needed, that change was inevitable. It was why Lord Justice Leveson undertook the significant inquiry, and it is why we are here for this debate today. And as we debate how to move forward with Leveson, we have to be clear why we need to move forward. That must be our test, and we cannot miss this opportunity. Now, I have asked the First Minister to reflect on what Leveson says about him and about how he has conducted his relations with the media. On Sunday, he told the BBC that he was completely vindicated by Leveson. But I think that the First Minister knows they would need to have edited more than 27 words out of the report to draw that conclusion. But he knows, as everyone else knows, that there are lessons for him, and it will be for the First Minister to decide if he can proceed with humility to recognise the challenge that is made to him. For Lord Leveson was given a challenge. How do we balance the freedom of the press that we all should enjoy with protection for the victims of the excesses of the media? How do we ensure that when the media get it wrong again, there are consequences? And how do we support and indeed protect the vast majority of honest and hard-working journalists who are just trying to make sense of the world? How do we allow for the polemic and debate, and dare I say it, the wonderful role of the media in prodding a stick at pomposity wherever they find it? I believe that in his report he has set out sensible ideas which tread this difficult balance. It has brought about a lot of debate in the last few days from political leaders, from the media industry and from the victims through the Hacked Off campaign. But it is worth remembering that Leveson is the one independent voice in all of this, the one person tasked with picking through this minefield without any vested interest. And I believe he has not rushed act, but his report speaks of measured consideration. And I commend him for setting out a roadmap which we can all work to. Despite the divisions and rancour over the days since Leveson reported on Thursday, I am struck actually by how much agreement there is. It would seem that all the political leaders, the press and the victims have agreed that the status quo is not an option and that independent self-regulatory body is required to bring about change. And there is agreement that the freedom of the press is something too important to be left in the hands of politicians. We may argue about how we implement this and what constitutes a state regulation, but I do not believe these problems are insurmountable and that we can work together across political lines with the industry and the victims to find a way to implement the ideals that Leveson proposes. Surely it's not beyond us to find a way of setting up a system in which everyone can have confidence. We have managed it with the General Medical Council. Here in Scotland, no one questions the independence of the Auditor General or the Information Commissioner. Well, nearly everyone. In Scotland, these practices do not appear to be as widespread and certainly not as high profile. But we must understand that what happened to the Dowlers, the Hillsborough victims, Christopher Jeffries, were symptomatic of a culture and unchecked power and arrogance in some sections of the press that exists here in Scotland as well. The First Minister has tried to make the case for a separate system here in Scotland, and as a nationalist, he does not surprise me that is inevitable. It is worth remembering that even though regulation of the press is devolved, we have had a unitary authority across Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom since 1999. The problem with it was not that the same rules were applied in England and Scotland, it was that they were not applied robustly enough, if at all. Let's not make this another proxy debate about the Constitution, but a critical job in responding to those who feel provoked in the face of the press.
First Minister.
Leveson decided the point was that needed a statutory underpinning to be successful. But let's just suppose that the Prime Minister sticks to his guns and doesn't want any statutory underpinning. Then how could we have an LCM as proposed by Joanne Lamont in this Parliament if there's no legislation coming to have an LCM about?
Joanne Lamont.
But equally, what the First Minister is saying is that regardless of what's happening in Westminster, there should be a Scottish regulator with a Scottish responsibility, despite the fact that it would actually be very difficult for that to be managed. The First Minister draws comparison with Ireland. But of course, Ireland's relationship with London is not the same as Scotland's relationship with London. These are different matters altogether.
First Minister.
How could we have a legislative consent motion if there was no legislation at Westminster to give consent to?
Joanne Lamont.
First of all, the Labour Party said that they will bring forward legislation, but the point I'm making is the First Minister ought not to rule out something. He ought not to rule out something on the basis of his political views about where decisions should be made. His decision be on the basis of how best we serve the needs of victims. If nothing is happening at Westminster, then that creates a different context in here clearly. But the First Minister ought not to presume, and anyway, his argument has not been in the absence of action in Westminster. He has said from first principles it's the job of the Scottish Parliament to create a Scottish regulator. I will go into talks with the First Minister if he makes a commitment that he is ruling nothing out at this stage. For those of us who believe in devolution, we understand that just as some matters need to be devolved to give people more control over them, some things are better done at UK level. We do not devolve for the sake of devolving.
The member is winding up.
We understand at what level power works best, and that's where we place it. Given how closely the media across the United Kingdom is interlinked, I find it difficult to see how we'd be better served with our own Scottish Ombudsman, but that decision gets taken place in the context of what's happening across the rest of the United Kingdom. I believe we should have an ambition for a better media and better politics across the United Kingdom, and that is the case I will be making. Leveson has presented an opportunity to put right something which was not working. We cannot afford to get it wrong. We cannot allow this debate to be manipulated for anyone's own interest. It is too important. And the main message coming from this debate today should not be about how we define ourselves against each other, but how we propose to take this forward to serve the interests of the people of this country, and particularly those for too long who have been victimised by some sections of the press.
I now call on Ruth Davidson. Ms Davidson, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and may I take this opportunity to apologise to you and to the First Minister and to the Chamber for my late arrival today. Presiding Officer, when the full scale of the phone hacking scandal and illegal behaviour in the national press became apparent, major changes in press regulation was inevitable. It was inevitable because the people who matter most in all of this, and that's the public, had lost faith in a system which was meant to ensure the behaviour of journalists was kept within the bounds of reason and of decency. The opportunity that we have now is not only to restore faith in the regulation of the press, but to put the public interest back at the heart of everything the press does. We all agree that there cannot be a return to the free-for-all which existed before 2006. But it is also in the public interest that the government and that politicians are kept well away from control of the press and the freedom of journalists to report, to investigate and to express opinions. After an investigation lasting over a year, it was inevitable that Lord Leveson would recommend a major upheaval of our regulatory system. And indeed, major change is already on the way. Under Lord Hunt, a significant toughening of press regulation is underway, including a new investigations arm, the ability to negotiate compensation, and the power to levy fines for the worst offences. Today, the Prime Minister has sent a clear message to editors that those reforms must be introduced with urgency. Last week, in this chamber, there was a certain sense of urgency too, such urgency, in fact, that the First Minister abused First Minister's questions to make an unannounced statement on the Leveson-Report before he knew what it contained. Most sensible people would have waited to see what the report said before pronouncing, but the First Minister had already made up his mind that it would be introduced in Scotland. What he announced was a judge-led implementation body which would, and I quote, consider how best to implement the Leveson proposals in the context of Scots law and the devolved responsibilities of the Parliament. Seemingly, the First Minister had already decided to introduce something that he hadn't read. He said that the opposition leaders were being invited to talks because he wanted consensus for a way forward, and then he pronounced on what much of that consensus must be. The truth is that this First Minister is in a corner of his own making. He says he wants, and again I quote, a particularly Scottish suggestion and solution that meets our responsibilities. Yet his speech a few moments ago shows he misunderstands the position for newspaper publishers in Scotland. Firstly, newspapers here are well used to dealing with differences in Scots law while operating under one UK system of regulation, no matter how discredited that system may now be. Indeed, if there were problems with the Press Complaints Commission, they were not limited to one part of the United Kingdom, even if the most flagrant breaches of its code of conduct were committed by Fleet Street titles. The PCC has always had strong representation from Scotland, and until recently, 4 out of its 17 commissioners were Scots. Scottish legal advice was readily at hand to inform its decisions. There is nothing in the Leveson recommendations for the new regulatory body which require a different system of regulation here. Secondly, tinkering with Scots defamation law as an incentive for newspapers to join a new system isn't necessary. The protection against heavy damages for defamation, which Lord Leveson thinks his kite mark system could produce, would have very little impact in Scotland, where defamation damages have long been limited. Unlike in England, and the First Minister is right to point this out, there is no such thing as exemplary or punitive damages under defamation in Scots law. Until Tommy Sherrison was awarded £200,000, which, as we know, has never been paid, the biggest ever defamation damages award in Scotland was £60,000. Further, as the First Minister will know, there is already provision in Scots law for legal aid in civil defamation cases under legislation passed here in 2007 and 2010. So we have already made it easier for people of limited means to sue. It was out of our reforms in defamation law. I'd be delighted to give First Minister.
Ruth Davison, these are exactly the points that Lord Leveson makes. He accepts he didn't have time or opportunity to examine the Scottish legal system, which is why he's called on experts within the devolved jurisdiction to see how his proposals could be made to fit in a Scottish context. Now, isn't that a call from Lord Leveson himself for us to rise to that challenge? And can she just appreciate the difference between the context, the legal context of statutory underpinning and the actual body of regulation? A self-regulated body is not determined by this Parliament. What would be determined is our responsibility of the statutory underpinning. Does she appreciate that distinction?
I think what's important to look at is, first of all, Lord Justice Leveson does not say that there needs to be separate bodies across the different devolved jurisdictions. Secondly, what we also see from the proposals being put forward is that the newspaper industry does not want to deal with two systems. And I can't imagine that the people who are most important in this, and that is the public, want the confusing of two competing systems either. People want to know that they can go to a single body and be dealt with both quickly and fairly. If the First Minister, in fact, is if the First Minister is genuine in his support for a self-regulated system, and he told the BBC on Sunday that he wanted to protect a vigorous and self-regulated press, then he can't force newspapers to take part in his McLevinson plan. So let there be no doubt, even what has already been proposed by the PCC Chairman Lord Hunt will cost far more than the old system. So to set up a second McLeveson body would then add thousands of pounds of costs of publishers already stumping up more than they did before for what's being brought in down south. So there is no escaping the new UK system for the biggest publishers of Scottish newspapers. We already see that a number of them are preparing to sign up to that. So what we have to do now is call on the First Minister to see the sense that's been spoken across this chamber of accepting a UK-wide scheme for UK self-regulation. It must command the trust of the public, and it is the best way forward. Much has been said by my opposite number in the Labour Party, and of course by both the papers, in the papers, and by commentators over the few weeks about Mr Salmon's actions and what Lord Justice Leveson had to say about them. It is not too late for the First Minister to do the right thing and step aside from this process as it goes forward. His judgment was flawed in his attempt to curry favour with Rupert Murdoch, and his judgment is flawed when it comes to grasping the reality of the legal and regulatory landscape in which Scots newspapers operate. There does need to be a debate about the future of press in Scotland, but for so many reasons, this First Minister is not the man to lead it.
Mr Rennie, you've got 6 minutes.
We desperately wanted to shout out, it's not true, but when it's your voice against the powerful media, it just doesn't have weight. It was the voice of Kate McCann. And her husband, Jerry, he went on to say, we did approach the PCC about these articles, but the then chairman, Sir Christopher Mayer, explicitly told us that it would be better if we were to seek redress through the courts. I found it amazing that the press regulator could do nothing to regulate the press. These are just two well-known voices, but there are many, many more that Lord Leveson heard. And they were anonymous voices that are not heard within that inquiry, but are suffering in the same way as the McCanns suffered. Now's the time to act. We've got to act with sensitivity, but we've got to act. There's those who say, and there are some here who say that we should only act with legislation if the press fail to implement the independent watchdog. The one more chance kind of principle, you might want to describe it. Well, in 1953, we had 4 years after the Royal Commission, we had only after the threat of legislation did we create the Council of the Press. In 1962, we had a second Royal Commission. That said that there should be self-regulation that is effective. The third Royal Commission in 1977 said that we recommend that the press should be given one final chance. In 1990, Parliament backed the Calcutt Committee recommendations for radical improvements to self-regulation. In 1993, the review of the Calcutt concluded that the PCC was not effective and as a regulator of the press. It recommended the Press Complaints Tribunal backed by statute. And David Cameron, only last year, told the Commons, and I quote, I accept that we can't say it's the last chance saloon all over again. We've done that. So that's 6 chances over 6 decades. That's too many chances, I would say, over too many decades. And I heard the Prime Minister say this morning, and I quote, the clock is ticking to get this sorted out. Well, Prime Minister, the clock's been ticking for 6 decades, for 60 years. We've had many chances. Now is the time to have statutory legislation for an independent body. Now, we on these benches and our colleagues at Westminster support a vigorous free press that holds the powerful to account and isn't subject to political interference. But a free press does not and cannot mean a press that is free to bully innocent people or free to abuse grieving families. People who feel they have been mistreated by powerful newspapers need to know there is somebody prepared to stand up for them. What the McCanns felt must not be felt by anybody else if we in this chamber have got any responsibility and any duty. That's why we need an independent watchdog underpinned by the law, so that people can turn to them, so that newspapers have to listen to them and they have to act. We support some of the specific recommendations covered in Lord Justice Leveson. We've got one or two concerns that the First Minister referred to in terms of Ofcom. We're not quite sure whether their duty as a regulator of broadcast media fits well with being a kind of recognising body for independent watchdogs. We don't think that's necessarily the way ahead. But we need to have independent self-regulation overseen by an independent board. It needs to be appointed in an independent, fair, open and transparent way. It needs to have carrots and sticks, the incentives to make sure that people take part in the system. But we also need to have that recognition body. As I say, I don't think it necessarily should be Ofcom. But in terms of this matter about cross-border, I understand what the First Minister is saying about the responsibility in terms of defamation in this Parliament. But there's another aspect to it as well, and that is the Ofcom. We can't, I would say, have two authenticating bodies, two recognition bodies across the UK. That would mean that Scotland would be restricted to only having an independent watchdog in Scotland. To me, this authentication body, the recognition body, needs to be at a UK level. So we've got the option. So if we decide in Scotland, or the press decide in Scotland, they're going to have their independent watchdog just for Scotland, they can choose to do that. Because there might be a multitude of bodies that apply to be watchdogs. That's one of the possibilities. But by saying only this Parliament should authorise, should legislate for the authentication body, not the defamation, the authentication body, we're limiting the options. We're actually reducing the chances. In fact, we're ruling out the possibility of there being a UK-wide independent body. If the First Minister wants to intervene, I'll take an intervention.
He's misled himself in that. Any self-regulated body could apply to be considered as the appropriate body to be statutorily underpinned. It's for this Parliament to decide the criteria for that statutory underpinning. Can I also say that I think he misleads himself when he says Ofcom. I agree with him in Ofcom. I don't think that was the wisest suggestion, and it was only a proposal in the Leveson-Report. But it doesn't have to be a politician. It doesn't have to be anybody at all. It could be recognised by the courts as being an appropriate organisation in terms of the legislative underpinning laid down by this Parliament. So, at this stage, I'd say, all of us should just open our mind to the possibilities so as we can get to a solution.
Willie Rennan, you must come to a conclusion.
My mind was very open there. I'm actually trying to have a genuine debate about this, and criticising me for trying to have a genuine debate won't encourage open debate in that respect. But can I just say, so what the First Minister seems to be saying, is that he doesn't agree with legislating for an authentication body. That seems to be what he's saying. If that's the case, I would welcome another intervention, perhaps.
I'm pointing out I don't think Ofcom is the most sensible proposal I've ever seen. I'm also pointing out it doesn't have to be the Minister of Justice, as in the Irish situation. You could ask a self-regulated body to apply to the courts to be seen as the appropriate body as underpinned in legislation passed by this Parliament. Westminster could do the same thing if it wanted, and that doesn't actually prescribe who the regulatory body is north and south of the border. It just means it would be recognised under Scots law if proceedings were taken against it under Scots law. Really, I shouldn't try to create difficulties which are not actually there. We can live up to our responsibilities, which we must do, and do it in the most appropriate way.
Mr Rennan, you're well over your time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That seems to be a departure from the Leveson-Report, because he does recommend a recognition body. Now, he may be saying that as an alternative, but he would be better if he was able to set that out to the Parliament in full, so we can understand exactly what he means.
Mr Rennie, you must wind up now.
I will draw my conclusions to a close. Thank you, Deputy President.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the
open debate and time is extremely tight. Speeches of a maximum of 6 minutes. Mark MacDonald, to be followed by Paul Martin.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think it is worth taking a moment to reflect on where this situation arises from. And, if we look, for example, and Willie Rennie raised Kate and Jerry McCann as examples. There's also the example of Chris Jeffries, the landlord of the murder victim Joe Yates in Bristol. Ordinary people...
Mr MacDonald, can I stop you a moment? Can I ask members to stop having conversations in the chamber, please? Thank you. Mr MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. These were ordinary people who did not seek the limelight. They were thrust into the limelight in the case of the McCanns as a result of an unthinkable tragedy which those of us who are parents could not begin to imagine the nightmare that they went through, or indeed, in the case of Mr Jeffries, a man who had his reputation, his innocence and his dignity questioned and undermined by sections of the press. We also could go back further and look at the many ordinary, innocent individuals who in the past were wrongly outed as paedophiles as part of tabloid campaigns and who also had their individual reputations and innocence and dignity questioned. So it's not just about celebrities, although I do think that there are serious questions to be asked around the treatment of individuals in that area, and not just the celebrities themselves, but also their wider family. Indeed, Charlotte Church has spoken very openly and very honestly about the deeply personal impact on her family as a result of the coverage which affected her. And I think it's instructive when looking at the conclusions of the Leveson inquiry to look at the Irish example, because I do think that it does merit scrutiny. I'm not suggesting for 1 second that I'm saying it would be the all-singing, all-dancing panacea, but I do think that it is very clearly looked at by Lord Leveson and indeed should provide us with an opportunity to look further at this. And it's worth looking at where the genesis of the Irish model came from, because in 2003 the then Minister Michael McDowell established a legal advisory group to look at the defamation laws in Ireland and the possible reform of those, with a view to a statutory press council being established. And at the same time, there was also talk around reform to the privacy laws in Ireland and a need to perhaps strengthen and tighten privacy laws which would prevent against elements of press intrusion. Now, this led to the press owners and the National Union of Journalists looking at designing an alternative regulatory system themselves, looking at whether they could stave off the possibility of much harsher privacy laws being implemented, and they persuaded the government. They persuaded the government at that time to accept what at the time was on an interim basis a press council and press ombudsman system, which would be press funded and would be independent of the press in its operation. I'll give way to Ruth Davidson.
Ruth Davidson.
I thank the member for giving way. It's reported today by the Irish journalist Kevin Myers that the Irish Justice Minister is unhappy with the work of the Irish Press Council, and the Irish Parliament will formally scrutinise its performance in 2014. Does that sound to the member that the sort of freedom of the press that the First Minister has said that he wants to enshrine?
Mark MacDonald.
Well, I also look at the comments today, not today, I beg your pardon, on Saturday, December the 1st, in the Irish Times by the columnist Noel Whelan, who also says that while the Leveson model includes basic tenets of the Irish model, he actually believes that the Leveson recommendations would propose a stronger system than that which exists in Ireland. So it's not simply the case of looking at the Irish model in and of itself, but also looking at whether there could have been changes that were made. And indeed, to talk about the performance of the Irish model, Conor Brady, former editor of the Irish Times, said in today's Irish Times that in 2011 the Ombudsman processed 343 complaints, the vast majority against national newspapers, and what he said was that that was a great swathe of what might have translated into slow and costly litigation. A great swathe of what might have translated into slow and costly litigation being avoided as a result of the effective operation of the Ombudsman in Ireland.
Joanne Lamont.
If proposals came forward in the UK Parliament for an Irish-type model which would cover the whole of the United Kingdom, would you support it?
Mark MacDonald.
I think the First Minister has made quite clear that what he wants to see is in terms of the statutory underpinning, it should be around the adherence to Scots law by any regulatory body. He's not said in the debate today that the regulatory body itself should be distinctly a Scottish regulatory body, and we are relaxed about the proposals that come forward. But what I think Joanne Lamont must accept as well is that while she has said that her party has given an indication about introducing legislation, she must also accept that her party is not in a position to do so at Westminster at present and get it through Westminster, although we don't know what the position the Liberal Democrats would take on that would be. But at the moment, the position from the Government and the position from the Prime Minister would tend to indicate that that is not going to be forthcoming. So we must go forward on this, I think, on a cross-party basis. But it's very clear that the First Minister, despite what Ruth Davidson alleges, has never said that there must be a Scottish regulator, and has made it quite clear that the setting up of the body itself is a matter for the press. He said it to Brian Taylor on Thursday the 29th of November. He said it in First Minister's questions about a strengthened voluntary press council. He even said it in his Sunday Herald article on the 2nd of December, and again in terms of an interview on STV about the fact that it would be an independent press regulatory body. It would be for the press to come forward with a self-regulatory body. And finally, Presiding Officer, just on the issue around the Press Complaints Commission, those of us who have had reason to complain in the past will know the very clear disproportionality between the coverage initially and then the contrition or apology or retraction afterwards. I think that's something that fundamentally needs to be looked at, because reputations are often made or broken by the initial coverage, and often a small subheading or a small column saying that it was been retracted or apologised for simply isn't enough for those individuals who have to feel the pain afterwards.
Thank you. I must reiterate that I'm afraid there's no time for interventions. They must be taken within speeches. Point of order, Hugh Henry.
First Minister made a welcome commitment to try to proceed on the basis of consensus, and presumably he then has an open mind. Would it be possible to request, as the lead minister in this debate, that the First Minister actually attends the debate to hear what has been said?
That's not a matter for me under the standing orders. I now move on to call Paul Martin, to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. There's now even less time, so speeches must be less than 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I say, first of all, Presiding Officer, and recognise that a great deal has been said already in response to the Leveson inquiry from a number of contributors. And what has been compelling for me has been the fact that we have talked the talk for over 7 decades, over that 70-year period. And I think now is the right time for us to, take this once-in-a-generation opportunity to finally move on and move forward on this issue. I think it's also recognised that the Leveson inquiry highlighted the experiences of many victims who suffered at the hands of journalists who abused their power, journalists who hacked mobile phones and bank accounts, and done so without giving any consideration to the impact that their actions had on victims. But, Presiding Officer, the inquiry also heard from my constituents, Margaret and Jim Watson, whose daughter Diane was stabbed in a school playground by Barbara Glover in April 1991. And in December 1992, their son Alan committed suicide. Alan was deeply hurt with what was being said about Diane in newspaper articles. The newspaper articles were found in Alan's possession when he was found dead. The articles that were written by Jack McLean on behalf of the Glasgow Herald and Meg Henderson on behalf of the Marie Claire magazine. And Jack McLean and Meg Henderson both wrote these articles, and they done so with no resemblance to the truth about Diane. Their articles about Diane's murder were written without any proper research, and they made the most nasty remarks in connection with Diane's character. They should be ashamed of their contributions on those dates. And Diane's character was completely, and all of the comments that they made in connection with Diane's character were completely without foundation and were simply made up to ensure that they filled the newspaper column for that particular day. Of course, a lot of what was said by Jack McLean and Meg Henderson about Diane would have been done so in the knowledge that the family members would not be in a position to take action and defamation action against those particular journalists on behalf of a deceased family member. Margaret and Jim have campaigned for a number of years now to bring forward legal remedies on behalf of bereaved families to challenge inaccurate and defamatory information written about deceased members. Now, I understand that the Government have completed their consultation exercise on the possible options that may be available to deal with these legal remedies that may be available to family members. And I would, in the concluding remarks from the First Minister, ask him to comment on how they would wish to bring that forward following the Leveson inquiry. Presiding Officer, yes, we have a job to do to protect free press, but not at the expense of innocent people like Margaret and Jim Watson. I have known Margaret and Jim for over 20 years. I have long admired their determination to get justice on behalf of their children and in their children's memory. But we should continue to remind ourselves, and we should always do this, that Margaret, Jim, Alan and Diane did not choose to be in the public arena. That was not their choice. They should not have been placed in the position to have to be judged by the likes of Jack McLean and Meg Henderson. They found themselves to be victims. And we do have a job in this Parliament to ensure that we protect those victims from some of the challenges that they face in the media. Now, Presiding Officer, the inquiry also heard from the First Minister, advising us that he believed his bank account was hacked into by an Observer journalist. And he raised the matter with the Observer newspaper, but failed to report this matter to the police. Now, Presiding Officer, I have been an elected representative for nearly 19 years. During that time, I have attended a number of public forums, and I have sought to ensure that members of the public report every crime and ensure that I make sure that they're aware of the fact that unreported crime is not the way forward for their communities. I would ask the First Minister in his concluding remarks, and I would be happy to accept an intervention, for him to confirm why he did not report this matter to the police. I think the most senior politician in Scotland should set a good example by ensuring that unreported crime is reported at every possible opportunity. Now, Presiding Officer, this is a consensual debate. We recognise that. We recognise some of the challenges that it faces. But we do want the Government to recognise that there are various challenges that it faces in Scotland in regulation of press in the future. And we'd ask the Government to genuinely have an open mind as to how we go forward, and also reflect on the fact that victims like Margaret and Jim Watson and their families and others should not be placed in the position that they were placed in previously.
Thank you. I call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Graham Pearson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The word sensitive has occurred a number of times in this debate already. Let me just tell you what Harper's Weekly said about Abraham Lincoln, that he was a filthy storyteller, despot, liar, thief, braggart, buffoon, usurper, and so on. Interestingly, 100 years ago, Harper's Weekly closed for business, and today Abe Lincoln is on the $5 bill. Time sometimes provides the remedy, but mostly it does not. I have to say that in many instances, in a number of instances, I find what the media do with my heart, my head, my whole being utterly repugnant. I know that in the 1950s, round the family dinner table, my parents still talked about the 1930s support that the Daily Mail's proprietor required of his paper, that they supported the British Union of Fascists. So in 1964, when my mother, who took the News Chronicle, that paper was taken over by the Daily Mail, it was immediately replaced by the Courier. The Mail would not come into our house. Now, I may find, and others may join me in doing so, it utterly repugnant that a mainstream paper should adopt such political positions. But nonetheless, I absolutely defend the right of the Daily Mail and any other publication to take actions of its choice that are within the law. A diverse media, just like democracy, means respecting the rights of those with whom we may absolutely and fundamentally disagree. Like other politicians, and clearly that includes Joanne Lamont, I have to get my message across of what I'm doing to as many people as possible. I have to persuade and inform. I have to communicate. And our media, our newspapers, are a very important part of that. I have even visited the Daily Mail office up the stairs from time to time and successfully had them take stories from me. I've benefited from that process of proper engagement. I, as I'm sure other MSPs do, visit all the editors of my local newspapers, my local radio stations, the other broadcast media that come into my constituency, to see what they want from me, to seek to influence the filters that they will apply to what I say, to assess the support they're prepared to give to positions that I take. That's no surprise, it's normal business. But legal protections are there to help our media hold us to account when to account we should be held. And with that comes concomitant responsibility, not simply to obey the law, that's the duty of every citizen, but to behave in a way that is proportionate. We who are in politics often feel ill-served and ill-treated by the media, but we have the corporate strength of our political allies, the parties of which we are members, to fight back. But others simply don't have that power. And that is the essence of what Leveson is seeking underpinning for. Too many in the media have crossed the boundary into illegality when they've sought information. But even more to the point, too many have parlayed away the rights of private citizens for profit, not because of public interest. And on that basis, I very much welcome Joanne Lamont's remarks in relation to, for example, Millie Dowler. I cannot do anything but agree with what she had to say. Now, the media do have at their hand, when they get it wrong, the opportunity to correct it. As we heard from Mark MacDonald, those opportunities are too often grudging, inadequate, and in no proportion whatsoever to the original error. The Press Complaints Commission has a fine set of principles and operating standards, but in practice it seldom rises to meet the need, more often falls to the level of industry preference. Now, no one understands the print media better, I guess, than the print media itself, so self-regulation could be reasonable if properly delivered. But the present circumstances do not show self-regulation in a good light, does not show it's operating adequately. So, with the new PCC, or whatever body or bodies, there could even be multiple bodies south of the border. I can't discount that. I don't know what will happen. We need legal underpinnings to incentivise and to penalise when that is necessary. That's important. We've heard of the legal framework in Ireland. We know that that allows a free press and protects citizens. We can draw on the knowledge and understanding there when we look at what we require here. Each legal jurisdiction will need underpinnings that are specific to local law, but let's not take an early position as to how we achieve that. The principles and practices of a new independent PCC can easily be encompassed into one package, covering the Republic of Ireland, the whole British Isles. Let me conclude, Presiding Officer, by doing something I don't often do, but by quoting the Bible. Tract 10 of Thessalonians, prove all things, hold fast that which is good. Let's just try that one for size, each and every one of us.
Thank you. And I call Graham Pearson to be followed by Colin Keir.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Much has been said in this debate about the impact of those in the media on victims and witnesses who have become their target, and I would associate myself with all that's been said in that regard. But let's not forget that Lord Leveson reflects a low point in public life, even by modern standards. Lord Leveson's examination of the cesspit of corrupt relationships reveals the rich and powerful rubbing shoulders with politicians, various public servants, in pursuit of self-interest. And I would imagine there would be no surprise in the general public's mind in that regard. The dissection of greed and avarice in the report demonstrates the lemming-like pursuit by professional politicians of all parties in the chase after power, influence and control. Leveson, nevertheless, provides a snapshot of an alien life to ordinary members of the public, a snapshot where some people suspend all normal behaviour to surrender the future to acts of criminality, immorality, all in the complete absence of any notion of integrity. In a previous life, I would have recognised such traits as being part of organised crime, and I suggest many members of the public would see today in this light a form of a polite mafia at place within the media hierarchy. Any suggestion to resolve this matter simply by amending a voluntary oversight fails to realise the significant and powerful members of the media had the audacity to not only break the law, but to corrupt public officials, including police officers, to achieve their aim. And their aims were not limited to headlines alone. It's self-evident their aims included to control the very means by which they could dictate business success for themselves corporately and personally. Attempting to master government ministers, politicians, public service servants and police officers provided to them the best opportunity to deliver success in terms of senior media figures. The acceptance of cash, gifts and supposed friendships in exchange for special information, intelligence and favours, the very stuff entrusted to public figures, left the rest of us unprotected. We became the flotsam and jetsam of infighting between powerful figures. Even families struck by the most horrendous of circumstances, like Millie Dowler's parents, became pawns in the power play to demonstrate insider knowledge and thereby influence. And as others have commented, Scotland was not immune. There is a need to change the law and to introduce new means of oversight. In that light, the First Minister's intentions to play a significant part in the proposed cross-party discussions on Scotland's response to Lord Leveson plays poorly with me. The First Minister, whatever his motivation, was willing to engage with the Murdoch regime and promote their interests in the takeover of the Sky business. That in spite of already knowing the lengths to which the Murdoch Group were prepared to go in the Dowler case. Of course, I'm happy to.
Margot MacDonald. Thank you, Presiding Officer. Is it possible, do you think, that the First Minister had in mind not the interests of B-Sky B, but the 500-odd people's jobs who depended on that contract?
Graham Pearson.
The member makes her point, and as I indicated in my earlier speech, whatever his motivations, he was still willing to engage with the Murdochs, even knowing the impact of that involvement with the Dowler case. I'm sorry, I've only got limited time. The First Minister has 20 years' experience in the Westminster bubble and knows the impact of journalistic endeavours in that context. In addition, the First Minister, as was mentioned earlier, has on more than one occasion alleged that his bank account had been hacked by a journalist, though for some unexplained reason thus far, he's failed to explain why he has not complained about this gross invasion of his privacy and indeed the criminal act that it reflects. In terms of public duty, there is an expectation on the part of ordinary members of our society to report crime, and I would expect Mr Salmon to do likewise. In all other spheres of life, these circumstances would encourage an executive to step aside and ensure a fresh eye reviews the way forward with the intentions of providing this Parliament with a balanced set of proposals, and I would hope that Mr Salmon would reconsider his own situation. The idea that there should be cross-party talks is a necessary and obvious step. It should purposely examine the need or otherwise for a separate Scottish model of governance in terms of calling the media to account. The idea that Scotland must have an individual solution does not hold water. In many areas, oversight can benefit from a UK response. We do need legislation in this matter, and it needs to be effective governance. But we also require the reality of a free press. The way forward to be effective needs to be swiftly identified in this global environment, and we should maintain an open mind on what that solution should be.
Thank you. I now call Colin Keir to be followed by Christian Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was in South Queensferry on Sunday and was approached by a rather well-to-do retired gentleman who informed me that he'd been interested in politics for many years without being a member of any particular political party. In amongst the usual types of questions we all have to answer as MSPs, he told me that he had followed the Leveson inquiry since it began. His interest had begun with the anger many people experienced after finding out about the actions of some none too reputable journalists, newspapers and others. The tragic case of Minnie Dowler has really made him think that the government should take a hard line with, as he called them, the parasites of the press. As the months passed, the stories of Lord Justice Leveson's inquiry were followed by my constituent on TV, radio and print. He then informed me that the more he knew, the more confused in his own mind he had become on the subject. He still has no regards for those who acted illegally, but didn't know how to bring the press back into line without some serious, hard-hitting legislation. However, he said, I still like the idea of a free press. Presiding Officer, I believe that my constituents' views mirror that of many people. We know that something has to be done, but the consequences of getting it wrong are massive. Leveson points out in his report that there is much to admire about the UK press. As politicians, we may not necessarily like what we see in print, but that's life, it's democracy. It's clear, however, as the example given by Willie Rennie showed, that the current setup using the Press Complaints Commission has failed miserably. The public simply do not have faith in a system that has failed to deliver anything more than a slap in the wrist to the print media offenders. So I believe that we should act in a cross-party way if possible. I welcome the fact that the First Minister has offered talks with other party leaders on Thursday. I also welcome the idea of an independent implementation group chaired by a Court of Session judge to see how Leveson or a Leveson variant can be implemented in Scotland. I particularly like the idea that no politician should be involved in the group. And yes, I do believe that we require a Scottish solution simply because we do have differences in law to that of England and Wales. That said, I believe that some sort of statutory underpinning of Leveson's recommendations would be acceptable. In principle, of course, I would like all Scots law to be applied on all issues and not defer to Westminster anyway. The Irish model of regulation does have some attractive points, particularly that of the Press Council and the appointment of an ombudsman who can provide redress. It also would give some degree of similarity of process across these islands, not just within the UK. But I'm still rather open-minded on this. We are living in extraordinary times for the print media. Circulation figures for most titles are falling to a pale shadow of what they were just a few short years ago. Therefore, there should be protection for journalists against unscrupulous editors and proprietors. Journalists are under pressure due to the nature of the job, with deadlines and accuracy to take into consideration. So I'm glad that there has been suggestion that whistleblowing hotlines should be set up for journalists who feel that they are being pressured into breaking any code. Of course, Leveson wasn't just about illegal phone and computer hacking. The issues surrounding the relationships of politicians and the police to the press came into focus. Certainly, the rather cosy relationship between some journalists and senior officers in the Metropolitan Police should send out warnings to those who are drawing up new legislation that there should be clear boundaries in place. And, of course, while there is a press which provides political opinion in their pages, politicians, of course, will try to influence that opinion. Every party leader, whether at Westminster or here at Holyrood, has tried to get the message out and, with a bit of luck, have a campaign or an article with a slant in their particular direction. For as many years as I can remember, party leaders have been accused of being too close to newspaper proprietors. Some complaints are more justified than others. That's why I am pleased to see that the First Minister comes out of the report, in my opinion, well, to the point where Leveson says he can't be criticised. And I can't agree with Graham Pearson. I cannot agree with Graham Pearson about the fact that the First Minister should stand down from these talks. I don't believe he has anything to be defensive about, and he's the right person for that job. Mr Pearson.
Graham Pearson.
I'm very grateful to the member. Would the member accept that in terms of transparency and the perceptions in the general public, there would be some virtue in the First Minister having the courage to stand aside and leaving it to others?
Colin Keir, last minute.
Thank you. No, I don't think the First Minister does have to stand down. I think actually Leveson has provided the answer to that. He has nothing to answer for. He cannot be criticised, to use the words. We have an opportunity here to collaborate on a cross-party basis. The alternative is that consensus is lost and most probably the trust of the general public as well. My elderly constituent in South Queensferry wants to see politicians sort the mess out, then stand back from it. He wants to see the press returned to be a set of institutions which can be trusted and who report the news instead of being the news. Presiding Officer, I believe this is a subject where we can park up the sometimes tribal nature of the way we debate in this chamber. Thursday will be a first step. Let's try and rise to the occasion.
Christine Graham, to be followed by Hugh Henry.
It's interesting that Lord Leveson reflects on the commercial pressures on the press that to some extent drove some papers to a race to the bottom. And when we consider the drop in circulation of some of our own titles, the Daily Mirror down 8% to 21,000, Scotsman 14.8% to 32,000, and Scotland on Sunday to 17.7% to 38,000, we see the pressures on the press. There are no figures for the Herald and the Sunday Herald because that has been designated by its American owners a regional paper. Now, against that kind of pressure, and I'm not indicting those particular titles, we can see why some papers took the law into their own hands and developed it. In terms of Leveson, it's very important to note what the report does and does not say. At 12 of the executive summary, Lord Leveson says not a single witness has proposed that the government or parliament should themselves be involved in the regulation of the press. I have not contemplated and do not make any such proposal. It's important to put that to the side. Also recognise, Lord Leveson, that the vast majority of the press do not fall below ethical standards the public would expect them, and indeed they expect of themselves, but that a subculture in certain publications ignored and indeed flouted those standards. And indeed, the regional press can, in the main, be wholly exempted from criticism. And he also reminded us that many of the aberrations of certain aspects of the press were and remain criminal offences. There are some 90 arrests to date. And though the application of the criminal law of itself would not resolve the culture, the practice, and indeed the perception that certain journalist publications felt they were making their own lawmakers, it still has its course to run. And as for the PCC, even before this report was made, it was ineffective, to put it mildly. So even if we had not had the exposure of the horrendous phone hacking, it needed reform. And I quote from paragraph 42 of this as well, which states that the fundamental problem is that the PCC, despite having held itself out as a regulator and thereby raising expectations, is not actually a regulator at all. In reality, it is a complaints-handling body, and it was very much dependent on the press itself. So we needed reform. I think we all accept that some element of reform is required. But how this is to be achieved while ensuring the Fourth Estate remains robust, independent, indeed thrawn, pursuant and acting in the public interest is the challenge. And I'm back to that awkward word, regulation. Any profession I've been in has had professional regulation, a code of conduct. As teacher, I've got very little time. If I have time, I'll take you to the end. Teacher, lawyer, politician, and so should the press. But it must be independent, perceived to be independent of a particular interest. So I support the possibilities around an independent press regulatory body, and most importantly, its composition, a better balance between the profession and the public interest, and wholly devoid of politicians. And through this debate, I think it's been made clear that the independent press regulator body and the code of conduct, code of practice can be UK-wide. That is a matter for the press in discussion with other third parties. The distinction that is being drawn here is between what would recognise that independent regulatory body. So if it were UK-wide, embedded in Scots law would be recognition of that independent regulatory body. It would have no regulatory function itself. And I would quote actually from Leveson again, where he makes this plain at his summary of recommendations on recognition. 27, page 36 of the Executive Summary. In order to meet the public concern that the organisation by the press of its regulation is by a body which is independent of the press, independent of Parliament and independent of the government, that fulfils the legitimate requirements of such a body and can provide by way of benefit to its subscribers recognition of involvement in the maintenance of high standards of journalism, the law must identify those legitimate requirements and provide a mechanism to recognise and certify that a new body meets them. Just recognising and certifying that a new body, Scotland-wide or UK-wide, meets them. The responsibility for recognition and certification of a regulator shall rest with a recognition body, in its capacity as a recognition body. It will not be involved in regulation of any subscriber. So I think we're actually getting ourselves in a little bit of a muddle here where it's not necessary. I'll take you in a minute, Mr Finlay, but what we do have here would be a recognition that there are demands and requirements under Scots law, under civil law, which Lord Leveson himself recognised when he talked to civil remedies. And indeed, he actually talked about civil regulations changing. Can't do that. We still have corroboration in criminal affairs. So it would be a mess if we didn't have Scots input. Whatever is decided, we must take our time. There's no emergency. That essential freedom of the press to expose, to challenge, must not be constrained unnecessarily. But there is a huge difference from free press and a free-for-all of the press.
I now call Hugh Henry to be followed by Marco Biaggi.
Thank you. You know, we shouldn't take for granted the value of a free and robust press in this country. And Christine Graham has alluded to that, the need for a robust, independent and indeed, to use her word, thrawn press. Because I think we have all been beneficiaries over the years. There have been many scandals which would never have been uncovered had it not been for the work of the press in this country. And often the press do the job which, frankly, politicians should be doing in terms of identifying the need for change, identifying the need for justice. And we can go back many years and look at many papers, and indeed papers now in the News Corporation stable. Look at many of the investigations carried out by the Sunday Times insight teams over the years, which were, groundbreaking in their work. So we do need a free and rigorous press, and we only need to look historically at countries that did not have a free and robust and independent press to know the dangers of not having that. Graham Pearson and others have touched on some of the work that the press has done over the years. If it hadn't been for the press, would there have been change at Westminster in terms of how MPs regulate their expenses? If it hadn't been for the press, would some of the banking scandals that have come out of the financial crisis have been fully exposed? Joanne Lamont mentioned the thalidomide scandal and how families suffered for years, and it was the work of the press that brought that to light. So we should be able to say quite proudly that we have a campaigning an independent press in this country that is valued. But on the other hand, I think it's right when we look at abuses of the press to identify them and to say that that is totally unacceptable. Because the press cannot take to themselves the responsibility of saying how the law should be interpreted and how the law should be applied, and they should somehow be above the law. And a number of the things which have come out in recent years have frankly been a disgrace and a scandal, and the collusion with the police really has, I think, undermined the fundamental democracy of this country. But we also need to know, as ordinary citizens, that when the press behave badly and when there is abuse, that there is some way of holding the press to account. We cannot have a system where it's left to a few wealthy individuals who control the papers, or corporations who control the papers, to decide what will be printed, when it will be printed, and what is right and what is wrong. And victims do demand that there has to be something more than currently exists. Paul Martin gave a very moving example of how that has impacted in one family in Glasgow. And therefore, I think, the arguments about the last chance saloon that we've heard other speakers have mentioned, the number of times it's been mentioned over the years, that these arguments no longer apply. We cannot keep saying to the press, you will have one last chance, because the press has not shown itself as being willing and able to actually implement that one last chance properly. So it takes something more than this. And I think the Leveson inquiry has given us as politicians the opportunity to move this forward. Now, the fine balance that has to be struck is between an independent press and how you make sure that the aspirations of regulation are properly carried out. What are the suitable legal underpinnings? Now, I think there's a danger that we and the public would not forgive us if we allowed ourselves to have this debate caught up in the constitutional arguments that are currently going on, because what the public wants is the best and most effective way of dealing with a press that has let the public down. And we should not bring other arguments into this. If there is a need in Scots law to underpin something by the use of Scots law, then I don't think anyone, certainly in the Labour Party, would argue otherwise. How that's done is a separate matter. But I think everyone would, or most members of the public I've spoken to, would actually value a UK-wide system that is underpinned in whatever way is appropriate, because the nature of papers in this country is that they cross border, the news crosses borders, and people move backwards and forwards. So let's not get caught up in nitpicking about the Constitution, and let's actually make sure that we come up with something that is appropriate. Now, I welcome the First Minister's commitment to try and genuinely find a way forward. I hope that none of the proposals that he has made today are actually written in tablets of stone. I hope that he has an open mind and hasn't made a decision on them, and that other parties will be able to influence and contribute, because it can only be consensual if no decisions have already been made. And the final point about the First Minister's contribution, he does need to reflect on public perception and how he has been seen, and the way that he was the only political party leader to actually meet and provide hospitality to Rupert Murdoch after the Millie Dowler scandal came out. And I think that it would be better for us all and for this Parliament if the First Minister actually allowed someone else on behalf of his government to take this forward.
I now call Marco Biaggi to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, I'd like to apologise for being a little bit late to the Chamber. I'll pay closer attention in future to the running of business, and it was my responsibility, and I'm very sorry. But now that I'm here, I'm actually quite glad, because the debate has been, for the most part, quite civil, especially compared to some of the language that's been bandied about on the internet and elsewhere. There's a lot of alarmist language going about, but I think there has to be a realisation that, to a very substantial extent, UK newspapers are already regulated by domestic law. Their content is restricted by integrity of court proceedings, especially in the case of children, incitement, data protection, defamation law, which in England has resulted in the very notorious super injunctions, and obscenity. Now, all of these present very difficult balances between competing rights, and not to say that they're all striking the correct balance, but simply to observe that that exists in law already. The Leveson-Report, by contrast, doesn't actually recommend additional regulations like French-style privacy laws, which it well could have. But what it does recommend, very distinctively, is an industry-led body to manage, I suppose, standards of conduct, as the best term. And that focus on corporate governance and professional standards is the main reason why it really has to be paid attention to. I want to highlight one particularly welcome aspect, and that's the way it examined the international experience. The report itself draws parallels between the UK newspaper industry and other North European systems. The seminal academic work on comparative news systems by Hallen and Mancini in 2004 describes these as the democratic corporatist systems. And further research has found that this can be followed through, and that families of nations in terms of media systems exist. Those that are similar to the UK have vibrant and often very charged newspaper systems, as with the southern European systems. But what you see in Northern Europe is higher readership, which means greater resources, a more central role in society, more pressures to compete, and as a result, often riskier behaviour and greater responsibility fundamentally to society to get things right. And that's the same challenge that faces us, and that has been addressed through these models in other countries by a great range of means. When you compare the UK media market with even the US's, which has a potential customer base 6 times the size, the top-selling American newspapers have circulations actually lower than the top-selling UK equivalents. We have a success story in the newspaper industry in the UK, but it's one that we can't afford to lose in terms of trust. Now, briefly, yes.
In describing the success story, is he completely ignoring the fact that the Herald and Scotsman here are going to be very difficult to find anybody to read them in 5 years' time?
The circulation figures have been quoted quite extensively so far. I think if you actually look at the online circulation as well, readerships have actually held up a lot better than people expect. And in the new media world, the things that are most commonly exchanged on Twitter are links to articles on the Scotsman and the Herald. So although the patterns of readership have changed, I think the level of penetration in society remains strong. But there are 3 points I would like to look at from the international comparison. The first thing is that everything that is recommended in Leveson happens in at least one other European country, one other that's nearby, and that is free and democratic. Not only is it the case that UK titles have raised no complaints about operating their subsidiaries in Dublin under the Irish Press Council, Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index 2012 rates Ireland as the 15th most free media system in the world. The UK is actually 13 places lower at 28th, and all the countries with forms of press council, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden and Germany, as highlighted in Leveson, are ranked above the UK at present. Secondly, every country has adapted to their local circumstances and legal traditions. In the Netherlands, there's a very strong sense of journalism as a profession like medicine or law, and so the main sanction is a name or shame, whereas in Sweden, there has been a preference for direct financial penalties to corporate owners. This is where we have to realise that there is a separate need for a Scottish statutory underpinning, so as to recognise not only our values, as is the case with everything that this Parliament does, but also to recognise the distinctiveness of our own legal system, and indeed to look at the pattern of the industry in Scotland, because if it is to be led by industry, then clearly the relative weights of key figures is different based on Scottish circulations. I would perhaps draw attention to Section 5 of the Climate Change Act of 2009, which creates, as just one example, which gives a statutory underpinning to the advisory role of the UK Committee on Climate Change, which gives it the power to advise the Scottish Parliament, even though it is one system for the whole UK, but gives the Scottish Parliament the ability to designate another should it wish. Now, obviously, there's no direct, it's not a like-for-like comparison, but it shows that you can have that there. Lastly, the third point really is that in every country, industry's participation is important. It has to buy in. And Leveson points out, page 1670, that there is a fear in the media of a legislative solution. I see today the UK Culture Secretary has piled in. I don't think that's the best way to do business, even if it does ultimately become the way. I would prefer to avoid it at all possible, and above all, the debate that we have here should remain a partnership focus, because knees have been jerking in Westminster, and here we should sit down, calm down and work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now Colin Patrick Harvey, to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The First Minister began by stating that he opposes state regulation and supports voluntary self-regulation recognised by Scots law. I think it's fair to say that the Leveson proposals are a bit of a compromise between what those of us who might want firmer state regulation and those who are ideologically opposed to any form of regulation, some of whom actually would like unregulated broadcast media as well. The Leveson proposals are a compromise between the views of people at the ends of the spectrum. And it's perhaps the case that only a compromise is the sensible thing to suggest. So the debate now has been about how does Scotland respond? How does the UK respond? And to what extent does a response need to be distinctively Scottish? It is clear that the industry are being invited to come forward with proposals about the bodies which will take a role as regulators. And we do need to wait and see. It may be that there'll be only one. It may be that there'll be more than one. And it might be that nothing will happen south of the border. So we do need to wait and see. I don't think either side of this debate should be ruling in or ruling out a single UK body or a separate Scottish body. Do we need separate legislation? Very clearly, because the legislation is already distinctive, and we'd be shirking our responsibilities if we said that in no circumstances would we pass separate legislation. And to come into the chamber, I have to say, with a dismissive soundbite like McLeveson, does indicate to me that some people are using this debate as a way of continuing to position ourselves in relation to the very media who are under discussion. We need all of us to somehow summon up the courage to have this debate as though they weren't listening. Politically, we also need a distinctive debate in Scotland, because there are many principles to be balanced. Some people are very clear about the principle of the freedom of the press. It is an important principle, but there are others. Public interest, honesty, right of redress for people or groups of people who've been wronged. Many people would assert that privacy is a principle, as well as respect for equalities and human rights. Now, if this Parliament isn't going to have a debate and constructive legislation which balances these principles in the way we see fit, we would be shirking our responsibility. And I give way.
Neil Findlay.
And I hope that whoever is summing up for the government will address this as well. One of the things that Leveson does point out is the power of the press in regards to lobbying. Can I ask if he would welcome a statutory register of lobbyists? And can I also ask that to the government in summing up?
I thank the member for the intervention. He already knows that I welcome the fact that we'll debate his proposals, but I want to see the detail before I make a final decision on whether I vote for the precise form that he's going to bring them forward in. I mentioned the need to remember the other principles, including honesty, right of redress and respect for equalities. And in Chapter 8 of Part F of the report, Leveson goes into issues about the representation of women and minorities. And I would like to spend a few minutes addressing that. Some really examples which I hope will appall members right across the chamber. For example, the juxtaposition of an article expressing outrage at a satirical programme on paedophilia next to an article commenting on the size of a 15-year-old child's breasts. Next to that, the Daily Mail's support for, in quotes, traditional values, alongside the online version of the paper's sidebar of shame. The Sun, the Star and the Sport come in for substantial criticism, all three containing articles which appear to eroticise violence against women. One example from the Sport involved a comment piece expressing the writer's desire to have sex with a celebrity and joking that the only way that would happen was if he raped her. The critics of page 3 style content have come in for substantial criticism from the same newspapers as well. And Leveson concludes, describing the female critics of page 3 as fat, ugly, jealous, feminist fanatics, harridans and battle-axes goes some way to proving their point. And I think Leveson has it right in that instance. The report goes on to discuss the treatment of transgender issues, including several papers' use of words such as freakish and revolting about individuals, named individuals, and one named individual 5 years old. Perhaps, it says, there was a public interest in the story itself, but included with the story was the child's name, date and place of birth, birth certificate, photographs of the child and the name of school and hospital she attended. A 5-year-old child, as well as condemnation of the child's parents for allowing her to be diagnosed with a condition. The criticisms go on, and I don't have time to address the issues in relation to asylum and minority ethnic groups, but Leveson concludes that the failure is systemic in relation to the press as a whole. It is not down to specific instances, and he concludes a new regulator will need to address these issues as a matter of priority, the first steps being to amend practice and the code to permit third-party complaints. Deputy Presiding Officer, I do hope that there is support for such a proposal across the chamber, and I look forward to further debate on these issues.
Thank you very much. Now call on Dennis Robertson to be followed by Kezia Dugdale. Up to 6 minutes, please, Mr Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, this morning in GMS, the first soundbite I heard from Gary Robertson at 6 o'clock was that the Chamber would be debating Leveson and we would be locking horns. Presiding Officer, maybe this is precisely why we're having this debate. Because why did Gary Robertson, and maybe one of the clan but no relative, why did Gary Robertson use locking horns and not take the initiative to say that the Chamber would be looking for a consensual debate on Leveson? This is perhaps where we do have the problem, Presiding Officer, that quite often the media do try to steer the public in a particular direction. We've been talking this afternoon about the press. The press aren't a faceless minority. The press are individuals. They are journalists. They are editors. They are owners. And I think when we look at the responsibility of those who produce the newspaper and come up with the headlines in our radio and television, we've got to ask, what is their contract of employment? Do they have an adherence to moral conduct and moral standards within their contracts? Now, obviously, there are freelance journalists, etc., out there. And today, we've heard, actually, from a former journalist that you can misinterpret what is actually being said, even within this chamber. Absolutely.
Margaret MacDonald.
I thank the member. I speak as a former journalist. Most journalists I worked with were very much aware of the truth that had to be told in the stories. But he posed the question, why did Gary Robertson, he named him, describe this chamber as locking horns over the question? Because members of this chamber had put out press releases in the sort of terminology that would induce him to say locking horns instead of suggesting that we're going to have a consensual debate.
I thank the member for the intervention. However, I would still come back to the fact that there's many other aspects that was out there within the press that he could have been stating a consensual debate. Presiding Officer, I stand here and I had thought about making an apology to you, Presiding Officer, and to this chamber for once again personalising what I'm going to say this afternoon. But in February 2011, when my daughter died, the press were at my door by tea time. My daughter died just before lunchtime. I had a reporter knocking on my door looking for a story. I was shocked. We were in an emotional turmoil. My wife and family, and especially my daughter Fiona, couldn't understand. How did they know? How could they find us? In such a few hours after Caroline dying, they were knocking at the door. We, of course, sent them away. Our grief was private. But the following morning, before 8 in the morning, there were knocks at the door again. We had 7 journalists before lunchtime, Presiding Officer, the day after my daughter died. One journalist in particular was so apologetic and said, I'm here, but I don't want to be here. I'm here because I've been sent. I'm here because if I don't come, I've got to answer to my editor why I didn't. Presiding Officer, that's an unfortunate side of the face of the press. But I come down to, again, it's individuals. Is it the editor's responsibility, the journalist's responsibility? Who thought that my daughter's death was in the public interest? Presiding Officer, I wasn't an elected member then. And a year after that, I came to this chamber, to this very spot, and I had a members' debate, and I talked about Caroline, and I talked about the eating disorder. And the reaction from the press was one of great sensitivity. They reacted in a manner which we and I do applaud. They reacted to a situation, not sensationally, not to sensationalise, but they acted with compassion. And we have a press that can do that. We have a press and a media that has that ability for balance. We do require some regulation, but it should be voluntary. Presiding Officer, I say to the industry, look at your contracts. Presiding Officer, I want to commend the people that spoke to me after the debate. Colin Mackay, Glenn Campbell, from the radio and television. But I want to name one particular journalist from the written press who I think summed up the reaction from the members' debate that I had, and that was Andrew Nicol. And that may surprise a lot of people. And I haven't named the newspapers that came knocking at my door. I haven't named the ones that kept phoning me weeks and weeks afterwards, still wanting stories in the interest of the public. I haven't named them or shamed them. They know who they are.
Regret you should be closing soon, please.
Presiding Officer, I will conclude with this remark. They can regulate themselves, they know how to regulate themselves, and they should regulate themselves. Thank you.
Many, many thanks. Now call on Kezia Dugdale to be followed by John Mason. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I start by commending Dennis Robertson for his incredibly moving speech. He has an incredible ability to grab the attention of the Chamber in a way that few other members can, and I thank him for that. I understand, Presiding Officer, that I only have 4 minutes. If that's the case, I won't be taking any interventions. I'd just like to make that clear from the start. Lord Justice Leveson describes the press, all of it, as the guardian of the interests of the public, as a critical witness to events, and as the standard bearer for those who have no one else to speak up for them. He goes on to quote Thomas Jefferson, who said, "Where the press is free and every man able to read, all is safe." Fine words indeed. To say that you support Leveson does not mean that you oppose a free press, however. I would argue that regulation is often, in fact, the enabler of freedom. For example, the Financial Standards Authority's regulations against insider trading help to ensure the freedom of the market. A press subject to independent regulation proposed by Lord Justice Leveson is still a free press. But we do need to recognise the pressure newspapers are under in a 24-hour news cycle and the explosion of online and social media. I'm a news addict, Presiding Officer, but that doesn't mean that I buy a lot of newspapers. I consume most of my news online, and I rarely pay for it. I get the news headlines every morning from Twitter, hairdryer in one hand and my iPhone in the other. Picture it if you dare. So there's a big question mark over the financial viability of newspapers, who have yet to find a way to make money from news available free of charge. Leveson makes reference to this. He says social media, such as Twitter, have all contributed to a dramatic change to the cost base and economic model on which newspapers are based. And this, in his view, has increased the pressure for exclusive stories. You can see the temptation to behave badly build. I raise this, Presiding Officer, in order to provide some economic context for Leveson. It's hard to see how we'll be able to get the cultural revolution we need from the press without ensuring their financial sustainability. And I would argue that the freedom of the press is under far greater attack from the changing nature of the economics of journalism than it is from anything contained in Leveson. And I fail to see how the cost of 2 regulators in any way helps that case. At First Minister's questions last week, Presiding Officer, Joanne Lamont asked the First Minister when he last complained to a newspaper about its coverage. The First Minister replied saying, "I will check the record and see whether I can help Joanne Lamont with that." I understand, Presiding Officer, that information has still to be disclosed. Surely, in light of all that has been discussed today, the First Minister understands his need to keep his promise. In that spirit, I wonder if the First Minister, in closing, could comment on that and reflect on paragraph 134 of the Executive Summary from the section Press and the Politicians, where Lord Justice Leveson says, "I have recommended as a first step that political leaders reflect constructively on the merits of publishing on behalf of their party a statement setting out for the public an explanation of the approach they propose to take as a matter of party policy in conducting relationships with the press." If we are to take the First Minister's word in good faith that he is committed to changing the nature of the press in this country and its relationship with politicians, surely today he will tell us when he will answer Joanne Lamont's question and also when he will commit to publishing his statement of how he deals with the press.
Thank you very much. Now call on John Mason to be followed by Margaret MacDonald. Up to 4 minutes, please, Mr Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And clearly a lot has already been said today and in the media beforehand. I think the key issue for me is that we have tried a totally voluntary system in the past that has not worked, and we need a stronger system going forward. And of course there is a balance between freedom on the one hand and responsibility and being held to account on the other. But that is a balance that needs to be found in many areas of life. We as individual MSPs have to balance freedom with responsibility. Every citizen has to get that balance right as well, or society will act. The broadcast media has to get that balance as well. And so to say that statutory involvement means no freedom is clearly nonsense. It has been said that the Telegraph is a good example of press freedom leading to the exposure of MPs' expenses scandal, and I think Hugh Henry was referring to that earlier when he said politicians should be doing the work that sometimes the media is doing itself. I have to say I was elected as an MP just too late to begin fiddling my expenses. But as I understand it, the Telegraph was using stolen material, and it seems to me if there's one lesson from that episode, it is not that newspapers should be encouraged to break the law, but that there should be more openness generally, for example, through stronger freedom of information legislation, as we will be looking at the Finance Committee tomorrow. One of the issues I wanted to touch on was attitude. At the Finance Committee, we've done a study on employability, and a number of employers have stressed to us the importance of applicants' attitude more than paper qualifications. And I think that does apply to our debate today. Many of us have or would travel miles and miles to appear on the radio or the TV, or otherwise in the media. Are we as politicians too obsessed with the media generally? Are we too worried about tomorrow's headline? Because if that is the case, it is bound to create unhealthy relationships. It's not just rules and regulations which need to change, but I believe our own internal and individual attitudes. I think we should be wary of pointing at individual MSPs and saying that one is closer to the media than another. The reality is we are all too concerned about media opinion of us, and I think we should take collective responsibility for that. On the mace it says justice, compassion, wisdom and integrity. Are we being wise when we deal with the media? Are we dealing with the media with integrity? But I believe these values do not just hold for 129 politicians within this Parliament. They also apply outside, including to the media. Does training journalists include wisdom, justice, compassion, integrity? Are these taken into account in the recruitment process and when people are promoted? I think a number of professions are struggling these days with the questions of ethics and values. This certainly includes my own accountancy profession, where so often there has been an emphasis on keeping within the rules, but the bigger picture has been lost. I was struck too by Lord Andrew Phillips, who I believe is a Lib Dem peer, speaking at a recent charities ceremony, and some of the words he used in this regard. He talked specifically about, in the business side, staggering corruption at the heart of the city and other financial centres, and he was encouraging belief that within charities there are other values. He said, "We parliamentarians kid ourselves that passing endless laws, which are rarely reviewed or implemented, solves social problems. All of us must work for a renaissance of moral values." He says our British reputation, I'll forgive him for that, for integrity should still enable us to take the lead. In conclusion, then, on whether Scotland should take a different route from the UK, it's good if that can be discussed amongst the party leaders on Thursday. But we should not be afraid of taking a different route. Some speakers today have come across as a little bit timid. Sure, let's talk more about that and let's try to agree a way forward. But once we have decided that, let's be bold. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Margaret MacDonald, after which we move to closing speeches. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm aware of the fact that I did intervene a few times, so I'll try to keep it below 3. In the matter of the First Minister's bank account, I can see why anybody would want to keep their bank account secret. I think there's nothing wrong with that, and we're being far too prissy if we say there is. Because lots of people, and I have known this in the past, have decided to call it quits rather than have more publicity over something that was already embarrassing to them, perhaps. So therefore, I can quite see why, in this case, I don't see why he should be embarrassed, but why he might have felt he wanted to keep some of his personal affairs private. But a free press is essential for a democracy, and we can't get round that. So we have to look at what Mr Biaggi was saying, and that's the changing nature of the press and the rules that we devise to make sure that it stays free and responsible are going to reflect that. And Kezia Dugdale was absolutely right. It's the economic stupid that are driving this debate. It's nothing other than that. The journalists who are sent out, as we heard from Mr Robertson, to do jobs that they find utterly distasteful and they feel dreadful about because they know they'll lose their own job if they don't do them. It's because their paper is under pressure. Their paper's not selling titles, not selling copies rather. It's not making money. So therefore, don't let's forget that that's what's driving the change in standards, I believe. That and a culture that Hugh Henry referred to and the leader of the Labour Party had the courage to refer to in the prominent position that was occupied by a few people who didn't appear to have the sort of morality in relation to dealing with other people that the rest of us have. I've worked as an investigative journalist for Radio 4. I took over after Roger Cook. Some of you may remember him. He made his name by sailing close to the wind and breaking the law. I did equally good programmes and I didn't. And I had some thought for the responsibility. And there's many a time I have not done anything about a story because I knew there were children involved who were utterly innocent. That represents the press also, and I would ask the Chamber to remember that when they determine how they're going to have a regulatory body. I'm sure we can self-regulate without statutory interference.
Many thanks. Now move to closing speeches, and I call on Willie Rennie. Up to 6 minutes, please.
I think Margaret MacDonald made a very good contribution. I think what she actually managed to identify, along with many others, is that there is good journalists, and we shouldn't generalise. We do often condemn others for generalising about society and about groups and minorities. We should not generalise about the press, and I hope the press up in the gallery are still listening. I was reassured. I was reassured by some of the remarks from the First Minister earlier on about the potential for a cross-border independent watchdog. If he's saying that perhaps the courts, it could be the Scottish courts, that rather than Ofcom, that authenticates, authorises the independent watchdog, and you could potentially have dual registration, which would allow for UK-wide independent watchdog status for organisations, and I think that would be a step forward. I think this Parliament does have to take a responsibility. However, we should recognise that we have passed LCMs in the past, and Westminster is perfectly capable of doing so as well as legislating for Scotland. But I think we should see how that develops over time, and if we can do it here, we should do it here. But I think the most important thing in this regard is the consideration of the members of the public who want to take a complaint against the media. It should be simple, it should be quick, and it should be cheap. And if they have to work out which regulatory body they have to go to, and it increase the cost, that's something we should be against. So if we can achieve, and I'll be looking to have discussions with the First Minister about this on Thursday, if we can achieve the possibility of a UK-wide independent watchdog to make it simple, that should be a positive thing that I would welcome. We should, however, engage at a UK level, and I would encourage the First Minister to touch base with the UK party leaders and have a discussion with them. I think his contribution to that discussion would be helpful. It might help persuading my colleagues in the UK coalition to see the light and perhaps agree to legislative underpinning of this process. So I think his involvement in that would be welcome. The Prime Minister did say back on the 7th of October that said he would implement Leveson if it was not bonkers. Now, I don't think Leveson's bonkers, and I've not heard anybody describe it as bonkers since. So I hope the Prime Minister might just look back at what he said on the 7th of October and might agree that legislative underpinning as a central part of Leveson is something that we should proceed with. John Mason was right to say that we need to strike a careful balance. It is important that we do recognise the freedom of the press as well as the freedom of the public. Freedom of the public from bullying and intimidation from newspapers, but also freedom of the press to scrutinise people like me and others in this chamber. That's really important that we do protect, and we shouldn't go from one extreme to the other and condemn all the press and say that everything they do is wrong, because that is not the case. As Marco Biaggi said, they are already limited by law. There is limitations in place. What we're debating here is what extent that should be, what should be the involvement of the state. And I think by having legislative underpinning of an independent watchdog run independently is something that we should support. We should also recognise, when we talk about independence, the PCC is hardly independent from politics. I mean, 3 of the last 5 chairs of the PCC have been Tory politicians. So you could actually argue that the independent watchdog that we're supporting, that underpinned by the law, would actually make it much more independent than it currently is. So I think it's something that the media should welcome, is separating the politicians from the press. And actually, I think it will give them protection as well. The carrots and sticks that we've talked about will actually provide some protection for the media. It will mean they're not dragging on with court cases for a very long time, costing them a lot of money. It would give them some great advantages. And I think Hugh Henry is right when he said that we need to have a process that's not just available to the wealthy, those who can afford to pursue, but it should be for all. And again, cheap, easy, quick redress for members of the public through a process that everybody recognises is something that we support. I have to commend Colin Keir. For being the only SNP backbencher who decided to defend the First Minister on the back of Leveson. I have to say, when the First Minister takes out of context cannot be criticised, I think it is selectively quoting from it. The real question for the First Minister, if he had his time over again, what would he do? If he had made that phone call to Jeremy Hunt or to Vince Cable, the Secretary of State, what would he have done? Would he ask them to have taken jobs into account and act unlawfully according to Lord Justice Leveson? Because that's not what I expect a First Minister to do. He can't just simply say it's their responsibility to take that into account. He needs to recognise that he, as First Minister, has also got a responsibility. But I don't want to sour a reasonably, hopefully positive contribution. I do want to say that there has been... You've
got 15 seconds too.
There has been a great degree of consensus in the discussion this afternoon. I hope we can agree to move forward for legal underpinning of an independent watchdog so that we can move forward, so we cannot repeat the mistakes of the past. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now call on Animal Goldie. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. There aren't many more important debates on how we, as a Scottish Parliament, respond to the findings and recommendations of the Leveson Report. And as I've heard, that inquiry was set up by the Prime Minister following the uncovering of the phone hacking scandal, a scandal which I think we all agree shocked the British public to its core. And the inquiry exposed unethical as well as illegal conduct by some elements of the press. Now, that's the dry technical description. To the broader public, it laid bare squalid practices and unprincipled and shameless behaviour which all reasonable people find repugnant. But the inquiry went further. It demonstrated the elementary failure of the current regulatory regime and a fundamental failure of our political system over the past 2 decades to tackle a problem that was intensifying. It was in that context, Deputy Presiding Officer, that Lord Justice Leveson asked what the Roman poet Juvenal asked nearly 2,000 years ago, quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who guards the guard dogs? Well, Lord Justice Leveson has published his findings and recommendations, and in amongst the responses and the commentary, I think one feature has emerged. This is not simple, and whatever we do, we should do it with caution. And I think in many respects, the debate has captured that mood. There were some measured and reflective contributions from across the chamber. Dennis Robertson's was particularly courageous, and from a different perspective, Margot MacDonald's was very thought-provoking. Yes, we need to do something. We should be mighty careful about what it is we do. The Leveson inquiry also took place against the background of the democratic tradition, the freedoms and the values that we cherish in our open society. These freedoms are the envy of oppressed peoples across the world. And Thomas Jefferson said that the only security of all is in a free press, adding that it was necessary to keep the waters pure. And Lord Justice Leveson echoes these sentiments because he says a free press is the lifeblood of a mature democracy. Now, that is not something to be sacrificed or lightly put at risk. That does not mean the freedom of the press is unlimited. There are legitimate boundaries within which it must operate, and an effective system of regulation is essential to ensure that these limits are adhered to. Now, today we have heard many members add their voices to this debate, and while at times these may have been in disagreement with one another, I think we should remember what we do all agree upon. Firstly, that we as a Parliament have a duty to consider these findings and recommendations, although I would observe, Deputy Presiding Officer, that responding does not necessarily mean legislating. And secondly, that the status quo is no longer a tenable option. Change cannot be resisted. It must be nurtured and it must be delivered. And Lord Justice Leveson rightly criticises the current regulatory system. The Press Complaints Commission made the press judge, jury, executioner in their own case, inherently flawed. And in its place, Leveson recommends an independent self-regulatory body to remedy what he saw as a profound lack of any functional or meaningful independence from the industry. Under his model, appointments will be independent and representative of the public interest, as will also be the setting of standards of conduct. He also details a speedy complaint handling mechanism with significant remedial powers as part of a new regulatory system. And these are the central recommendations of the report, and they are ones that my party, I'm sorry, I have a lot to get in this, Graham, if you forgive me just now. These are the central recommendations of the report, and they are ones that my party accepts and endorse to this Parliament. However, Presiding Officer, we do not believe that statutory underpinning is necessary to give effect to the main findings of the report. And interestingly, Lord Justice Leveson, I don't know whether Ms Sturgeon and Mr Sweeney share this view or not, but if they listen they might learn something of the report. Interestingly, Leveson himself identifies that very tension. He notes that a balance must be struck between the use of statute to deliver independence and the risk that the use of statute might introduce an element of state control of the press, which is clearly unacceptable. Now, it's the view of my party that any form of statutory provision which enacted the requirements, and that's Leveson's language, that a regulatory body must fulfil, inevitably introduces a risk of political interference in the freedom of the press. You can't help it. Such a statute as that controls the press. Governments pass statutes, and there is the rub. So to introduce such legislation onto the statute books of the United Kingdom or onto the statute books of this Parliament would be an unprecedented step. Presiding Officer, I want to end my contribution today by returning to what my colleague Ruth Davidson argued in her speech. A two-system solution, as the First Minister has proposed, whereby the rest of the UK goes one way and Scotland another, I think is unrealistic and I think is unnecessary. Because almost all of the largest titles and media groups in Scotland either trade throughout the United Kingdom as a whole, or they're based in England, or owned by non-Scottish proprietors. Now, newspapers are used to dealing with differences in Scots law. They do that day in and day out. They're also used to operating under a unified UK regulatory system, albeit that system was imperfect. Now, given this context, a Scottish solution will mean having to sign up to two systems. Presumably that also means paying for two systems, and I don't think there's an appetite for that. Indeed, Leveson even noted this in his report when he recognised that there was no reason why a new regulatory system could not easily apply across the various legal jurisdictions of the United Kingdom. Presiding Officer, I return to Juvenile, whose friends advised him to adopt the following plan: bolt her in, constrain her. The free press and its crucial role is of such paramount importance that I don't think we can follow such an approach lightly. Bolting in and constraining.
Mr. Drawing to a close, please.
Bolting in and constraining through statutory provision susceptible of political meddling is only the answer of very last resort. Let's move forward together. Let's take the key principles of the report. Let's find a way together on a single UK-wide basis to deliver them.
Thanks very much. Now call on Patricia Ferguson. 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has been a serious debate on an issue which is likely to be the subject of continuing national debate across the UK. We've heard some powerful contributions this afternoon, and some very considered points have been made by colleagues from all sides of the chamber. But what is of paramount importance is that a system is put in place that is independent, proportionate, transparent and fair, and crucially, has the confidence of victims in that it applies to all newspapers and titles. Now, I believe that Lord Leveson's proposals set us on the right track. It took Lord Leveson over a year of investigation and consideration to come up with the extensive report published last week. His inquiry was established with cross-party support at Westminster and it's just a pity that his proposals do not enjoy similar backing. This afternoon, we have heard the same concerns. Happy to take an intervention, Mr. Stevenson.
I just seek a bit of clarity. The member said she wanted all newspapers to be part of the body. Would it be the case that you would wish small local newspapers to be part of the body? Given that it's going to cost newspapers, should it not be voluntary in exchange for benefits that are delivered under the law?
Mr. Ferguson.
Well, I think that's actually one of the matters that has to be discussed more with the regulatory body when it comes through. I think Mr Stevenson makes a very valid point that that discussion is one that has to be had with the smaller titles, because it is very difficult for them to operate, as my colleague Kezia Dugdale pointed out, in the current economic situation without taking it that further step. So I do accept the point that he's making. But I was about to say that this afternoon we'd heard the same concerns expressed by the Conservatives here as those at Westminster. But I truly believe that they should think again. The Conservatives seem to argue that for them the stumbling block is the underpinning by statute of the new regulatory body. But surely here Lord Leveson has exercised a particularly light touch, as the independence of the system would be enshrined in statute, and the regulatory body would make sure the self-regulator remained independent. Now, Scottish Labour does not support state control of the press. We do not think that politicians should meddle with the content of newspapers. We are clear that free, probing and irreverent press is essential to democracy and should be able to hold the powerful to account. But it must not abuse its own power nor victimise the defenceless and vulnerable. Leveson's proposals allow a system of regulation independent of politicians as well as the press. Lord Leveson has also helpfully suggested some carrots to try to help to maintain the proportionality of his proposals and to encourage acceptance by the media, and I think that is to the good. Now, the First Minister wants us to commit to having a separate system in Scotland. Now, we don't believe that the case has been made for a separate system, and we would hope, genuinely hope, that the First Minister will not close his mind to the arguments put to him today. Many of the titles which would be covered by a Scottish regulator operate in the rest of the UK too. So how does it help to have a separate system in Scotland, separate from that in the rest of the UK? We've heard mention of the cost, not at the moment, Mr MacDonald, we've heard mention of the cost, but more importantly, how does that help the victims who may then perhaps have to approach two separate regulators? And the First Minister wondered in his contribution why we couldn't adapt the Irish models to our needs. So I would just ask the First Minister why it is we cannot adapt Leveson to our needs. I've looked at the Irish system reasonably carefully, and the Irish system allows serving editors to be on its regulatory body. And it has, as Kenneth Roy points out today in the Scottish Review, on at least one occasion criticised the style of prose employed by a journalist. Now, I wouldn't expect that any system we would want to be involved with would do either of those two things. But in addition, it only allows the individual who has a grievance to take forward that grievance to the Press Council. No one else can do it on their behalf. Mr Harvey.
Patrick Harvey. Is the member aware that the article in question, which was only criticised, not in any way censored, was actually a racist rant containing racist and sexual innuendos about African men and implying that the only thing Africa had given to the world was AIDS? I think we should be comfortable with valid criticisms being made of that kind of journalism.
Richard Ferguson.
I very much take Mr Harvey's point, and I absolutely agree with him about the points he makes. However, the criticism went on to talk about the style of the prose as well as the content. I have no problem with the points Mr Harvey made. I would just say that I do not want a regulator that looks at the type of prose that any journalist is using and considers it a matter for criticism. Mr Harvey is right to make the distinction between the 2 points, and I was about to do the same thing myself, so I'm grateful to him for that. I would make the point too to Stuart Stevenson, who made a very interesting contribution, and he did labour the point of activity that was within the law. But I would say to him that he will have heard Paul Martin's very powerful contribution this afternoon about a situation where journalists did not break the law, but still caused great offence, great anxiety and great harm to a family. And indeed, Dennis Robertson, in his own contribution, made very similar points there. And I think that is why we need to have a strong regulator here in this country. And Graham Pearson was absolutely right to highlight the actions of some elements of the media and the way in which those in power, in the police, in politics and in the media, gravitated together in an invidious alliance that had the best interests of no one but themselves at heart. Now, Christine Graham is absolutely right to treasure the independence of the press, and I would concur entirely with her comments in that regard. And so too, Hugh Henry was correct to identify the cross-border nature of this debate, and the concern that redress is available to all, and that it doesn't just become the purvey of those who are able to afford to access it. Patrick Harvey was also right to say that Leveson is a compromise, and he's absolutely right about that. But I happen to think that it's a fairly clever and sensible compromise, which is why I think it should be supported. But he is also right to point out that there has been in some newspapers a complete disregard of equalities issues, and the kind of examples he cites are absolutely damning. Presiding Officer, Scottish Labour would wish to be part of a constructive dialogue with the First Minister. We hope that he will keep his mind open about the nature of the process and indeed about his own involvement in such a process. And at the end of the day, we believe that the actions of all must be guided by the needs and requirements of the victims.
And I call on Fiona Hislop to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary, you have till 5:15.
Presiding Officer, I am very pleased to make the closing speech in this debate on the way forward for Scotland in the light of the report by Lord Justice Leveson of an inquiry into the culture, practices and ethics of the press. A number of speeches took some time reminding us of the background to the issue. I thought in particular Dennis Robertson gave us a very wise speech on his personal experience of the two sides of the media. And although, of course, it would have been courteous of the UK Government to make the report available in advance to party leaders in the Scottish Parliament, there is some advantage, as I think we heard, from taking some opportunity for some reflection, a few days' reflection before holding this debate. It's allowed us a chance to begin to assimilate the report, and I believe there has been some thoughtful contributions that we've heard of the way forward in our thinking, and I think that's a very positive development. I am going to try and respond to as many of the contributions as I can in the debate. In particular, Graham Pearson's contribution, I actually agreed very much with the first half of his speech, where he set out very serious concerns about the impact on public life, in particular of relationships with the press. Paragraph 117 of the summary recommendations, I quote, "Taken as a whole, the evidence clearly demonstrates that over the last 30 to 35 years, and probably much longer, the political parties of UK national government and of UK official opposition have had or developed too close a relationship with the press in a way which has not been in the public interest." I also would note that there is recognition on page 1439 that, conscious that that's a limited extent, refers to Liberal Democrats in relation to that description. But he also says on page 1438, and he makes it very clear, that the parties of devolved government are specifically excluded from this general criticism. I quote, "In my opinion, the conduct of politicians of devolved government cannot reasonably be considered as part of the historical UK national pattern with which my generic conclusions are concerned." Now, with that strong indictment of the UK government parties and indeed opposition over many years, I am not hearing Mr Pearson or Joanne Lamont or Ruth Davidson saying that that prevents somehow David Cameron or Edward Miliband taking forward the proposals in that regard. And as the devolved administrations are exempt, I think it's perfectly correct that the public, and more importantly the victims of the press in Scotland, look to this Parliament for a lead and look to this government and the leadership of this First Minister in leading this debate and taking forward cross-party talks. And I'm also very pleased that I understand that all the parties have agreed that they should take part in those discussions. And I think that's where we want to take the issue forward. Ferguson.
I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would accept that the UK political parties have, in fact, accepted the criticism that Lord Leveson has levelled at politics at Westminster generally, and perhaps we need to take a leaf from that particular book.
Cabinet Secretary. He exempted us from that criticism. Now, I want to move on because I think it's more important that we do move on. Of the main areas covered by the Leveson-Report, almost all are devolved to this Parliament, namely regulation of the printed press, Scots private law, including defamation, criminal law, including contempt, police functions and prosecutorial functions. Now, the only key areas that are not devolved are data protection and media plurality and competition. So in considering how we discharge this Parliament's responsibilities, I think there are some common values that we share. None of us want to see regulation of the press by the state, and neither does Lord Justice Leveson. All of us believe in the freedom of the press, and I think Stuart Stevenson in particular set out that particularly well. The Scottish Government wants an open and inclusive approach to determine the Scottish response to the Leveson report. And I really want to give assurances to that request made by Patricia Ferguson, Joanne Lamont and others. And we have deliberately framed this as a debate without motion, to allow members not to be unnecessarily corralled into a fixed position. And I thought Marco Biagio set out, I think, the position very well, that instead of a knee-jerk reaction, we can actually think through the issues as they apply in the context of Scots law. And I think the importance here is that we want to see the independent implementation group looking at how we can underpin in Scots law a framework of self-regulation by the press. And I think Mark MacDonald set it out quite well, and he said this is about the press coming forward with their framework. And one of the key issues is actually about how we have the recognition of that framework or that body. It would be up to the press, not the government, to decide that framework. Depending on what the press decides, that structure could also cover other parts of these islands, and I think that's a point made by Willie Rennie and indeed in some of the Labour members as well. However, the statutory underpinning cannot simply be UK-wide. It must adhere to Scots law, and that's where the implementation group, I think, can bring us their advice on that issue. So to consider how best to provide that statutory underpinning and to consider how best to respond to Lord Leveson's report as a whole, we envisage that the expert implementation group would look at that issue chaired by a past or present Court of Session judge. Now, I want to address particularly some of the issues that were raised. I want to move on. I've got a number of issues to address, if you will. Some of the issues we will need that implementation group to look at is the arbitration panel, as set out by Leveson, the more appropriate route, or the Irish system of an ombudsman? Secondly, who does the recognition? And that's the point Christine Graham, I think, in her speech raised, and the concern about Ofcom and ministers, etc. And I think that's where the proposal, perhaps, that the court could recognise be the recognition body is one way forward. And I think a very important point made by Paul Martin, and I thought a very concerned and reflective speech about the situation of the Watson family in particular. Rosanna Cunningham set out at the end of 2011 that an extension of the law may not be the most appropriate way of delivering the requisite protection, but she added we will want to consider carefully the outcome of the Leveson inquiry to inform the final conclusions. Now, Lord Justice Leveson, I understood, certainly heard evidence from the Watsons and certainly in his report extended and stressed his sympathy, but he came to some conclusion that there may be better remedies. But I think we probably can look at that conclusions from Leveson in that regard further at a later date. Kezia Dugdale asked if the Scottish Government would release information about our meetings with the press. Well, can I tell Kezia Dugdale the Scottish Government does, and we're more transparent than the UK Government. The list of meetings covers a longer period. It includes editors and proprietors, and indeed the UK Government list covers proprietors and senior executives only, and of course all of the First Minister's correspondence with the Murdochs was released. But the important thing, Presiding Officer, is to consider how this Parliament takes things forward. In the Leveson report, he says, and I quote from the first paragraph of the first page, My report may be less helpful to those with decision-making responsibilities in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, but I have sought out to set out my analysis and conclusions in a sufficiently explicit and reasoned way to enable the experts within the devolved jurisdictions to see how they could be made to fit. So that is the task that we face. That is what we need to do in taking things forward in terms of implementation. And I want to, I don't usually quote Conservatives, but perhaps to Ruth Davison, I will quote Ken Clark on page 1756 of Leveson. And he says, "I am not convinced, though, that a statutory underpinning of some kind would amount to state control of the press. You've pointed out the statutory duty of the Lord Chancellor to uphold the independence of the judiciary. I would note as well that press organisations have a legal obligation to register with Companies House and HM Revenue and Customs as businesses. This does not appear to me to amount to political interference in their work. This is not my endorsement necessarily for statutory backing, but simply an observation that it would not be the freedom of expression Armageddon that some commentators would have you believe." So I think in terms of developing the arguments, in terms of looking at statutory underpinning, there will be a way forward. I would hope certainly within the Scottish context, and that's the Scottish context in Scots law that we want the implementation group to look at. Presiding Officer, it has been a worthwhile debate. If I haven't managed to respond to every point I made and suggestion offered, I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to do so as we go forward. And I'm sure if we can move forward in a positive way, I'm sure that we will have a number of opportunities in the future to debate the Leveson-Report in this Parliament. But, Presiding Officer, there is most definitely a Scottish interest in this debate. There is most definitely a Scottish Government duty to take forward this issue. There is most definitely a responsibility for this Parliament to rise to the occasion and ensure that we find a way forward that implements Leveson's proposals, reflecting a distinct legal system in Scotland, and so that the victims of the press are responded to in the way that they expect and that we can deliver.
That concludes the debate on the Leveson inquiry.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I rise to raise a point of order relating to parliamentary written questions. On the 5th of October, I raised a number of specific parliamentary questions regarding the attendance and activity of Scottish Government ministers, officials and agencies at the 2012 Ryder Cup. I received a holding reply from the Minister on the 2nd of November, which promised a reply to my questions as soon as possible. Subsequently, on the 14th of November, almost 6 weeks after I had submitted my original questions, Claire Adamson MSP submitted a more general question in relation to the 2012 Ryder Cup. Ms Adamson's question was answered within 2 weeks, on the 27th of November. On the same day, I received answers to my own questions, which simply referred me to the answer given to Ms Adamson. Presiding Officer, I found it disrespectful to Parliament and parliamentarians that the Government has chosen not to answer my own specific questions, but a more general question submitted by one of their own backbenchers 6 weeks later. Presiding Officer, can I ask that you use your authority to ensure that my questions are answered in full, without delay, and make it clear that the Government should answer all questions in a prompt and even-handed manner, and not use what I can only describe as a planted question to undermine the ability of opposition parties to properly hold the Government to account.
I thank the member for the advance notice of this important point of order. This has enabled me to investigate the matter myself. As Mr Griffin says, on the 5th of October 2012, he lodged 3 written questions asking the Scottish Government for details relating to the attendees and the costs of the delegation attending the 2012 Ryder Cup. These received a holding reply on the 2nd of November. On the 14th of November, Claire Adamson lodged an inspired parliamentary question on the outcomes of the First Minister's visit to Chicago in September 2012. That inspired question was answered at some length by Fiona Hislop on the 27th of November. Also on that date, Mark Griffin received written answers from Shona Robson, which simply referred him to the answer given to Claire Adamson. For a member to have to wait nearly 8 weeks for an answer to a parliamentary question, and then simply be referred to an answer given to a question lodged 6 weeks after his original question is not, in my view, acceptable. Please do not applaud. I note that the Scottish Government's own guidance on using inspired questions to give information to the Parliament, which is published on its own website, states that, quote, where a question on the same subject already exists, consideration should be given to using that question to make the announcement, whether or not it is an opposition question, instead of arranging an inspired question. It appears that this guidance has not been followed in the case of Mark Griffin's 3 written questions, which predate by 6 weeks Claire Adamson's inspired PQ. I expect the Scottish Government to treat all members equally when responding to written and oral questions, irrespective of which party they are from. I consider that the Government has treated Mr Griffin with discourtesy, and I invite ministers to reflect on how this answer was put into the public domain and to consider what steps they need to take to ensure that members are not treated with such discourtesy in the future. No need to applaud. We now move to members' business. Members who are taking part in the debate, please remain. Those who are not participating in the debate, please leave so quickly and quietly.